This page is the front cover of issue 4 of N64 Magazine. Looks like it's from July 1997, going by the date up top. Blimey, that's a blast from the past. Para GT. Right in your face is Mario Kart 64. Big surprise there, that was the killer app for the console back then, wasn't it? Says UK version reviewed, so finally we got our hands on it. They're promising. Maps for every course, driving masterclass, secret shortcuts, multiplayer tips, and times to beat. Sounds like they're giving it the full treatment. You know, all the usual stuff you'd expect to get good at it and rinse your mates. There's a little round bit saying, Tim's ISS 64 result. Masterclass. Must be about International Superstar Soccer 64. Tim must be showing off his skills, likely a football game result and tips. That was always a bit of a laugh. Melang. Down at the bottom it says plus, Japanese and US news and reviews. So a bit of import stuff then. Always interesting to see what Japan got first. There are little boxes showing games. Struggle Hard, fighting game maybe? Holy Magic Century, sounds like an RPG. And Sonic Wings Assault, that's a shooter, I remember those. And then there's How to Survive in a Japanese Arcade. That's a bit random, but intrigued to see what that's about. Probably just common sense stuff like don't spend all your money in one go. Overall, yeah, Mario Kart 64 front and center, which is no shocker, and a few bits and bobs to keep you reading the rest of the mag. Standard stuff for the time, really. This page of the N64 magazine starts off with a bit of a cheeky question. So can you tell me now, what's the name of the game? Right next to the N64 logo, very clever. They're laying out their stall, telling you what to expect from this new mag, things like top-notch reviews packed with tips, and they're not going to shy away from calling a game rubbish if it is, which is fair enough. They reckon they'll be showing off the best pictures, not padding things out with boring stuff, and be full of advice for us N64 gamers every month. The editor, Jonathan Davies, in his little photo there, is welcoming us and banging on about how good he is at Mario Kart 64, better than his mates apparently. He's mentioning they haven't reviewed loads of games this month, but they will have a look at things like Troublemakers, Multi-Racing Championship, Hexen and Dark Rift soon, games from Japan and America as well. Apparently there's some big E3 show coming up in America, and they'll be covering that too. He also mentioned some new bloke joining the team called Paul Jarrell. Oddly, he also goes on about some plant pot and white flowers. Bit random, but there you go. At the bottom it says ABBA are big Nintendo fans, you know. Right then. This page from the N64 magazine, it's the contents page, issue 4 from July 97. Right there on the left you've got Donkey Kong looking a bit manic behind the wheel of his cart. Looks like a Mario Kart vibe, which makes sense as it's right there on the page. Mario Kart 64 is the big feature. Finally landed on the N64 apparently, and they've got an 18-page review. Must have been a big deal back then. They've got a bit about N64 Arena. Starts on page 28, sounds like their review section. Then there's Mortal Kombat Trilogy, page 48. Apparently the PAL version is less thrilling, whatever that means, maybe a bit slower or something. And then Import Arena, for all those fancy Japanese and American games, starting on page 50. Lastly, War Gods, another game on page 50. Described as the N64's first 3D beat-em-up, they are giving it the once-over. Starts on page 48 actually. Bit of a typo there maybe. Looks like a right mixed bag of games to get stuck into that month. This page of the magazine has a Planet 64 inches section at the top. Looks like news bits. First up is Holy Magic Century. Some surprise RPG news. Wasn't expecting much RPG action on the N64 so early on. Then there's Sonic Wings Assault. Described as flying and shooting, looks like a standard arcade-style shooter. Those were 10 a penny back then. Struggle Hard is next. They are calling it a temporary name for a beat-em-up. Tasty looking apparently. News Center talks about the 64DD. Remember all the hype around that add-on? And mentions Mario Kart being released this month. Everyone was waiting for that one. Coming soon section says sports games are the theme. So more footy and racing games on the way probably. Then further down the page there's N64 How-To section. Guides for games. First up is International Superstar Soccer, classic football game, and they are saying Tim is on the practice ground to help you master it. Next, become a Mario 64 expert. Well, everyone thought they were a Mario 64 expert back then, but apparently there's still things we didn't know, you know. Then, survive in a Japanese arcade. Bit random, never been to Japan myself. Arcades are arcades, right? War. There is a Team 64 inches section with photos of the magazine staff. James Ashton, Tim Weaver, Jonathan Davies, Will Overton and Paul Jarrell. Sounds like they all had a bit of fun at a print club booth, and they are all bantering about each other and what games they like. Jonathan Davies apparently thinks he's the champion of the world at Matzakart, probably a bit of an exaggeration. Game of the month mentions for each of them: War Gods, ISS 64, Mario Kart 64, Holy Magic Century and Mortal Kombat Trilogy. Catchbarkle. At the bottom there's Have a Nice Play. about American developers working on N64 games. Mark Ramshaw is rounding them up apparently. And finally regulars, which is the usual magazine bits, subs, tips, letters, directory, back issues, and what's coming in N64 issue 4. Standard magazine fare really. This page in N64 Magazine is having a look at Holy Magic Century, which they are calling the N64 Second Action RPG. Seems a bit early to be calling it that, as I can't think of another action RPG on the N64 just yet, but maybe they know something we don't. Anyway, it's a preview piece, and they're showing off some screenshots. Looks quite colourful and bright, even if a bit blocky. It's early days for the N64 after all. They mention you can play as 3 different characters, and that they all play differently, which is always a good thing. Variety is the spice of life, in it. There's a bit about the spells all looking the same at this point, which is fair enough. Previews are previews, things change. And a funny little bit about one of the characters, Nina, apparently asking for the nearest loo, which is a bit cheeky and British, very N64 Magazine. They're showing off various locations like spooky forests, and mentioning there are plenty to explore in this Holy Magic Century. Overall, it looks like it's shaping up to be a decent little adventure game for the N64, something a bit different from all the platformers and races we've been seeing. Could be interesting to keep an eye on this one. This page is a look at Holy Magic Century, a game from Imagineer for the N64. Remember Imagineer? They did stuff like Harvest Moon. Anyway, this Holy Magic Century, apparently they showed it off before as Crystal Stories, and it's shaping up nicely. Looks like an action RPG in the style of Zelda, you know, that top-down adventure style we were used to back then. The reviewer seems quite impressed, especially with the characters. They mention 3 main ones: a young wizard, a princess called Nina who's supposed to be a sassy 13-year-old, and a pirate called Kodzi. They're saying the graphics are much improved since they last saw it, with detailed characters and textures, and even the non-player characters in the towns are varied. It sounds like they are going for a sort of medieval Europe vibe, with towns and castles. The reviewer is also talking about the storyline, which is about spirit handlers, people who can control the elements. Apparently, misusing these powers created some baddies called the Evils, who feed off the 7 deadly sins. Bit dramatic, isn't it? But it sounds like your typical Japanese RPG affair, which, if you were into things like Breath of Fire back on the SNES, you'd probably be happy enough with. They've stuck it on their eager waiting chart, so they must think it's got potential. It's down for release in Japan in December and then January 98 for us in the UK. Seems like a decent enough game to keep an eye on for the N64. The next page in this issue has a look at Holy Magic Century. Seems to be an action RPG coming to the N64, and from the screenshots it's certainly got a Japanese vibe about it, with some rather odd-looking enemies. They reckon you can fight these jelly things with magic, or just by whacking them. Nice and simple. Apparently you'll be using the yellow C buttons for spells, which was pretty standard for N64 action games back then. They're making a point about the random battles and variety of enemies, mentioning rats and demonic jellies with one eye. Bit strange if you ask me, but then again, it's Japanese. The story sounds like your typical RPG fare, something about a young wizard, magical crystals, sacred swords fighting evils, and some diabolical lava. Sounds a bit bonkers, doesn't it? Anyway, Japanese gamers are getting it in December, and they're hoping we might see it in the UK by January. We'll see about that, won't we? Always a bit of a wait for these things to come over here. One of the captions mentions cat-person type monsters, and another one jokes about ice magic setting the jellies nicely in time for tea. Bit of a strange sense of humour these mags sometimes had. Oh, and they point out that numbers still pop up in battles, a nod to turn-based RPGs, apparently. Right then, moving on. This page then, it's all about Holy Magic Century for the N64, under the heading, Team Up. Looks like they're showcasing the 3 playable characters you get to choose from in this action RPG. First up we have the wizard, who is you apparently, which means you get to name him yourself. Very imaginative. He's your typical young apprentice wizard, 12 years old, small at 150 centimeters, and light at 42 kilograms. Abilities are magic and sword, so a bit of both it seems. The write-up says he's the main character, and will discover his talents as a spirit handler, whatever that is, and his impressive ancestry. Sounds like your typical RPG guff, to be honest. Then there's Princess Nina. She's 13, a bit taller at 155 centimeters, and slightly lighter at 38 kilograms. Her skills are magic, but defensive, and arrows, so ranged and support maybe. They mention she's in the tradition of Japanese RPGs, can heal, and might become a spirit handler too. Seems everyone wants to be a spirit handler in this game. Ekas. Finally, there's Kuzi the Pirate, a bit older at 15, taller again at 170 centimeters, and heavier at 70 kilograms. He's all about fist and sword combat, so the bruiser of the group. They say he lacks magical abilities, but makes up for it with sheer muscle. Right then, a bit of a stereotype there. Scattered around are a few screenshots, showing that blocky 3D look that was all the rage back then, and some UI elements, menus and bits and bobs. One mentions menus, another exploring buildings, and another about countryside fighting. Looks like a fairly standard action RPG for the time, but with a slightly odd name, Holy Magic Century. Sounds a bit much, doesn't it? To be continued, it says at the bottom, so I guess they'll be back with more on this Holy Magic Century next time. We'll see if it's anything special, won't we? This page then, blimey, it's a look at Sonic Wings Assault for the N64, back in issue 4 of N64 Magazine. Future look, they called it, all excited. It's an exclusive apparently, with new pics, and a chat with Paradigm who were making it, along with video system. Sonic Wings Assault, right, I remember that one. It was supposed to be out in Japan in July, and then for us lot, in the UK in winter '97. They're banging on about a fully 360-degree camera, which sounds a bit much for back then, doesn't it? And warning about needing vomit bags. Charming. They do say controlled flying needed, which is probably a good thing in a flight game. One of the captions mentions, Pilot Wings redefined flight sims. Bit dramatic, weren't they always? Apparently this game looks the part, graphically, and sims with its gorgeous landscapes. Indeed. Looks like it's got a two-player mode, which is described as rollicking, whatever that means. Someone's asking, how does it work? Bit sarcastic even back then, eh? There's some guff about steaming through apartment blocks and frigate exploding. Sounds like your typical over-the-top action. Sway's in-game missions are strikingly created, they reckon. Look, oh go on, they say, always trying to get you hyped up. It's just screenshots of planes flying about and exploding, you know, the usual. Still, flying games were alright back then, weren't they? Simpler times. This page is all about Sonic Wings Assault, or Aero Fighters Assault if you're in the States. Seems like the Yanks always have to rename things. It's being made by Paradigm Simulations, who did Pilot Wings 64, and they're teaming up with Video System from Japan. Apparently they've got a whole load of secret games in the works too, cheeky? Warrington. It's meant to be the first proper straight-up dogfighting game on the N64. They're saying it's based on the old Sonic Wings games from the SNES. Blimey, that was a while ago now, but it's been beefed up for the N64 with all its fancy tech. Sounds like it's got single-player and two-player, loads of different planes with their own handling, and even pilot characters from the original games. Weapons are meant to be futuristic and a bit mad too, and the enemy bosses sound interesting. They mention stealth submarines that fly bit bonkers. In it, they've got 7 missions lined up, all over the place, Tokyo, New York, even the Antarctic, and some secret final stage. The screenshots look alright, bit like Desert Strike someone reckons, lots of explosions and all that. They're banging on about how good it's looking, seems alright from the pictures. They're talking about Pilot Wings 2 as well, and maybe even an F1 game from Paradigm. Core, they're busy bees, aren't they? Looks like it's been in development since '96 and should be out soonish. Tim's off to E3 to have a gander. We'll hear more next month apparently. Sounds like it could be a laugh, might keep us going until Pilot Wings 2 anyway. This page is about a new beat-em-up game for the N64 called Struggle from Imagineer, and it's an exclusive first look. They're calling it a beat-em-up, which back then we were all still playing Virtua Fighter and Tekken, so it's trying to get in on that action but without the fireballs apparently, more about punching and kicking and throwing. The game is only 40% complete at this point, which explains why the characters look a bit basic and the backgrounds are still empty. They haven't even properly named it yet, currently calling it Struggle Hard. Very catchy, lads. It's supposed to be like Virtua Fighter, focusing on proper fighting moves rather than weapons and all that guff. The movement is already supposed to be fluid, and there are loads of moves, which is promising even if the backgrounds are still just placeholder stuff. They've got screenshots of the game, one with characters Valerie and Vincent fighting on a beach stage, and another with Yang and Crown in what looks like a ring. It looks a bit blocky, typical for early N64 days, but they say it's fun to play already. They score read. The reviewer reckons Imagineer might become a big name on the N64, especially with other games they are working on like Multi Racing Championship and Holy Magic Century. They think Struggle could be their big hit. Maybe even the next Street Fighter 2, which is a big claim. They're expecting a full review later in the year. We'll see about that, eh? This page from N64 Magazine, Future Look section, is previewing Struggle Hard. It's called Hard Looking Smashing, which is a bit cheesy in it. It's by Imagineer, and for the N64, naturally, and they're saying it's a 1 to 2 player game. They're banging on about how it's still in development and the characters don't have proper textures yet, just wrapped around their muscular bodies. Right, okay then. There are screenshots of two blokes, Tomahawk and Saeki, duking it out in a ring. One bit shows a ring out. They kale. Classic fighting game stuff. Another screenshot is of Judge's score, which they say is a departure for the beat, MUP. Sounds a bit fancy for a brawler, doesn't it? Apparently the points system is new, and about time too. Programmers of the world, according to them. Bit strong that. Then there's a bit about the character Crown being renamed to something more like Clown. Yeah, alright, probably a good shout. Bottom of the page says, to be continued, with more news coming as the game shapes up. Looks alright for an early N64 fighter I suppose, but we'll have to wait and see if it's any good, won't we? This page then, it's all about Mario Kart 64 finally arriving, and fair play. It was a bit of a moment, wasn't it? They're calling it the N64's second big game, after Super Mario 64, which is probably right. We all rinsed the SNES Mario Kart to death, so we were properly hyped for this. 4-player mode, blimey, that was something else back then, wasn't it? Really showed off what the N64 could do. Nintendo, bless them, even put on a go-kart race at Daytona in London to celebrate. Sounds a bit cheesy, but I bet it was a laugh. One of the journos, James, had a go and came in 5th. Seems quite pleased with himself. Oh, and they're banging on about coloured joypads. Bit of a gimmick if you ask me. Right at the side there's the usual magazine stuff, who's who on the team. Issue 4, July 97. Tells you when the next one's out too, Friday the 25th of July, so you knew when to pop down to WH Smith's. And this one was out Wednesday the 2nd. There's a little screenshot of Mario Kart 64 gameplay, looking pretty good for the time. And Yoshi's plastered all over the page in his cart, bless him. This page is the N64 board section, right, and it's all about Mario Kart 64 this month it seems. At the top left there's a bit about Nintendo's finances. More money coming in but less profit apparently. Sounds like typical business stuff really. Next to that, they're talking about a new third-party controller, called the Hudson Joycard 64 from Japan. Looks a bit like a SNES pad mashed up with an N64 one. They reckon it's comfy and has some auto-fire button, which sounds a bit cheap if you ask me. Down the page, big and bold, it's all about Kart and Mario Kart 64. There's a character selection screen, you know, with Mario, Luigi, Yoshi, Donkey Kong, Peach, Toad or Kinopio as they call him sometimes, Wario, and Koopa, or Bowser as most of us say. Below that, there's a competition. Win! The shirt off James is back. You could win a t-shirt worn by some bloke called James, who apparently stormed to 5th place in a Mario Kart race. Bit of a weird prize if you ask me, but hey, a free shirt is a free shirt. To enter you have to answer a question about how many pedals are on a 100cc go-kart, and send a postcard to an address in Bath. They even promise to wash the petrol fumes out of the shirt. Charming. Pokarth. Finally, the actual N64 board itself looks like their office notice board. There's a postcard from a reader in Norway, some computer-generated Mario, which sounds like a right mess, paper hankies for some reason, and they're saying the state of the office is a bit dodgy, which is probably about right for a gaming mag office back then. They mentioned fine art and computer printers, and something about Sailor Moon covers. Seems like a typical random collection of bits and bobs they've pinned up. This page in N64 Magazine, issue 4, kicks off with a bit of an apology. Seems like the dog ate their master copy, and they had to redo the whole magazine classic. They also announced the winner of some competition from issue 1, a Lee Riley from Blackburn who's bagged himself some N64 gear. Good for him. Ticker. The main chunk of the page is all about new goods, bits and pieces for your N64. First up is a memory card plus from Daytel, costs about 15 quid. It's a 1 megabyte card, which they point out is 4 times bigger than the standard Nintendo one. It's got a little LED display to show you which page of memory you're using. Sounds alright, reviewer reckons it works well enough and is better value than the official Nintendo one. They come in colours too, green, blue, red and yellow, fancy that. Next, it's the SharkPad Pro 64 controller from Interact. 30 quid it is. They reckon it looks a bit like a joypad but maybe not in a good way, calling it disappointing looking, but saying it shares innards with their SuperPad Plus, which they reviewed in issue 2 and gave 86%. They're using one in the office and say it's alright, especially with autofire and slow motion. 72% they give it, not bad. Then there's the Nintendo bath game. For 3 quid in supermarkets. It's like a Game Boy shaped thing filled with liquid and little plastic hoops you squirt onto spikes, featuring Donkey Kong in the background. They reckon it's a bit hard to squirt the gel, and give it 75%. A bit of daftness for the bath, I suppose. Finally, there's a big splash about the 64DD getting a release date. March 1998 they're saying. And Donkey Kong 2 apparently. But no modem, and it wasn't shown at E3. They mention it was originally meant to be out in Japan at the end of '97, but it's been pushed back. They say it's because Nintendo wants to make sure it's got a good launch with at least 4 games. Which makes sense, I guess. They mention gamers in Japan are a bit skeptical about the 64DD's capabilities for RPGs, and software in general. They also hint at the failure of Sega's Mega CD, and Nintendo's own Super Famicom CD drive, making them cautious. Mr. Yoshio Hongo, a spokesman, reckons the hardware is done, but software development is behind. A bit of a wait then for the 64DD it seems, but at least we know when to expect it. This page in N64 Magazine takes us back to July '97, eh? Right then, let's have a gander. First up in Video Nation, it's talking about Nintendo of America sending out a video to Nintendo Power subscribers and those who returned their N64 warranty cards. Apparently it's got new GoldenEye footage, the 4-player mode, and a bunch of old game stuff too. They reckon it's alright, but not as good as the video they did with issue 1 of N64 Mag. Modest praise indeed. Ooh-wee! Then there's Retro World. Jason Moore's retro section. He's telling us to dig out our old kit and get nostalgic. He kicks off with the Virtual Boy. Remember that red monstrosity? He says it seemed like a magic touch at the time, but it was a bit of a flop, wasn't it? Released in Japan a while ago, and coming to the US later. He mentions games like Mario Clash and Virtual Fishing, and reckons the game screens are alright for displaying limited colors. He notes there were about 25 games for it, including some classics, but still reckons it's quite easy to see why it didn't exactly fly off the shelves. Next is Lion & Watch, one of those old Game & Watch handhelds. This one's from '81. You control 2 lion tamers trying to keep lions in their cage using chairs. Sounds simple enough, but probably mind-numbingly repetitive after 5 minutes, eh? Moving on, we've got Castlevania 3 for the NES. Now that's a proper game. Proper gothic horror platforming. 17 levels apparently, including places with dramatic names like Tombs of Terror and Tower of Untimely Death. He mentions Trevor Belmont, the hero, and other characters like Syrax the Shavamp. He thinks it's a bit easy, despite the scary names, and the password system makes it easy to finish. Good music though, he says. Gets a respectable 68%, including warrant. After that, it's Lifeboat Game & Watch, another one of those handhelds. This one is about rescuing passengers from a sinking ship. Double-screen jobby, with rafts to catch falling people and sharks that eat them if you mess up. Apparently, the smoke from the ship is animated. Impressive for a Game & Watch, I suppose. It scores 75%. Kyubo. Lastly, in Retro World, it's Bubble Bobble, another NES classic. Bub and Bob, the Bubble Dragons. He's making a joke about goldfish and dinosaurs, which is a bit daft. Proper classic arcade game, and the NES version is still good. Catchy music that gets stuck in your head for ages. 2-player mode, you can waste hours on it. Gets a very decent 88% retro rating. Finally, there's Shig Showtime, which is about Nintendo at E3. Apparently, they are throwing a party at E3 in Atlanta, and will be showing off new N64 games, including Banjo and Kazooie, and maybe Ultra Donkey Kong, which used to be called Dream apparently, a cringeworthy new name, he says. Journalists can talk to Shigeru Miyamoto's dad and find out about the N64 and 64DD future. Rare, the British developers, will be there too. And the good news is, N64 Magazine will be at the event, and will have a full report in issue 5. So, there you go. This page is all about sports games hitting the N64, and they're kicking things off with American football. Now, we Brits aren't exactly famed for our love of gridiron, but they're giving it a go with Quarterback Club 98. Made by Iguana and Acclaim, it's a 1 to 4 player jobby coming out in the winter '97 in the US anyway, we'll see when we get it. They're promising fancy motion capture, better graphics, and all that N64 jazz. Apparently, even Vince Lombardi could be impressed, whoever he is. Loads of real players and stadiums, and they've even got proper player weights and sizes, or so they claim. Maybe even jockstrap sizes according to the magazine. Cheeky, AI with injuries and penalties, random weather, commentary, all the bells and whistles. They've even got this historic sim mode, where you can relive old matches, which sounds a bit different. Screenshots look like they're trying their best with the N64, bless them. And they're daring us to complain about the graphics, oh really? Still, plenty of sports games coming, that's for sure. This page has got a couple of previews, doesn't it? First up, it's WCW versus NWO World Tour. Remember that one? It was already knocking about on the PlayStation, and seemed to be doing alright in the States, so THQ thought they'd bring it over to the N64. 60 characters they reckon, which is a fair whack, including some of the big names like Ultimo Dragon, and even The Undertaker. Although I always found him a bit of a comedian myself. They're saying there's loads of moves, 40 odd per wrestler, which is a bit more than just slapping and kicking, I suppose. Looks alright in the screenshots, mind you, typical wrestling game from back then, a bit blocky but you can see what's going on, they seem to be pretty chuffed with it. Then underneath, there's Top Gear Rally. Another racer, eh? We weren't short of those on the N64, were we? This one's from Boss, Kemco, and BMG, and it's looking like Autumn 97 release. They're saying it's going to be at E3, which is fair enough, and it's up against Imagineer's Multi-Racing Championship. Apparently Top Gear Rally is looking better visually, with slick graphics and not much pop-up. They're banging on about weather effects, rain and snow, and even fog and flash floods in Multi-Racing Championship, which sounds a bit much, doesn't it? Two-player mode is mentioned as being good fun, and it'll work with the Rumble Pack too, which was always a nice bonus back then, wasn't it? They reckon it's compatible. All in all, standard preview stuff really, building up the hype for these games coming out later in the year. This page in N64 Magazine is having a look at a few upcoming games. Right at the top we've got Earthworm Jim 3, or Earthworm Jim 3D as they're calling it, for the N64 of course. Seems like Jim's making the leap to 3D, which was the big thing back then, wasn't it? They're saying it's from a Dunfermline-based mob called VIS Interactive, not Shiny Entertainment, who did the earlier games. Sounds like they are going for a real cartoon look, even in 3D, which they're comparing to Tex Avery and Warner Bros. Cartoons, so we'll see how that turns out. It's slated for early '98, for both the US and UK. The reviewer seems a bit wait and see, not wanting to get too excited just yet, which is fair enough, it's early days. Down below we've got a bit about Wild Choppers. Rumours are going around about this one, developed by Seta. Looks like a helicopter game, screenshots show some copters blasting away at tanks and stuff. Japanese release was meant to be summer '97, but UK is TBA. Sounds like it was delayed a bit as they mention it disappeared from schedules. They're hoping to get an import review done in the next issue or two, so they clearly weren't too sure what was going on with it. Pabi. Then finally there's Cruisin' World. Midway are doing this one. Eugene Jarvis is involved, he did the original Cruisin' games. This one's going worldwide, not just San Francisco anymore, so you'll be racing around places like the Great Wall of China and Red Square. They're saying it's going to be quite different to the previous Cruisin' games, and the reviewer reckons it's looking much better, calling the old one rubbish predecessor. Bit harsh maybe. Again, release dates are TBA for both US and UK. So a few games to keep an eye on coming up for the N64 there then. This page of N64 Magazine from July '97 is all about RPGs, which was always a bit of a niche genre back then, especially on consoles. The main headline screams 64DD monsters in your pocket, so naturally, it's about Pocket Monsters 64, which we now know as Pokemon Stadium. For the 64DD, they're saying it's officially announced for the N64, which is technically true, but it's for the 64DD add-on, which, let's be honest, nobody really had here in the UK. They talk about it being a 90s answer to Conkers and Link cables, which is a bit of a strange comparison, but I guess they were trying to make it sound relatable. There's a little screenshot of Pocket Monsters 2 on the Game Boy too, reminding us where it all started. Then there's an Ask Fusoya section, remember him? Bit of a know-it-all RPG guru they had. Someone's asking about Final Fantasy V-2 on the N64, and Fusoya's basically saying it's a massive game on PlayStation CDs, way too big for N64 cartridges, and even a squeeze for the 64DD, needing like 25 to 30 discs. He mentions cartridge restrictions being the reason Square aren't developing for the N64 at the moment, but they might reconsider with the 64DD. Someone else asks about multiplayer RPGs for the 64DD and Mother 3, and Fusoya doesn't really know much, mentioning rumors of a Namco RPG in Suikoden, and still unsure if Mother 3 will be turn-based. Another question is about a UK release for Mother 3, and Fusoya is non-committal, saying it's too early to tell. He also seems to think he's providing up-to-date RPG news, bless him. Rue. Finally, there's a little bit about Goyarmon, saying it's getting a date. Japanese import gamers, apparently, should mark August 7th for the release of his latest adventures. They mention Konami advertising it bizarrely, and tantalizing glimpses of playable characters, and even a dragon ride. Sounds a bit bonkers, Goemon was always a bit out there. This page from the magazine is having a look at a couple of upcoming games, and a bit of industry gossip as usual. First up there's Chameleon Twist from Nihon System Supply. Tongues are all the rage apparently, with this platformer where you play a chameleon. It's a 64 meg cart, for 1 to 4 players, and it's due in Japan this summer, no idea when we'll see it here. Typical. Apparently you use your tongue to grab enemies, pull them in, spit them out, all that kind of thing. There's a story mode and a battle mode for multiplayer scraps. The reviewer reckons it's aimed at the younger players, which probably means it's a bit kiddie for my tastes. But the screenshots look alright, simple enough. Then there's Troublemakers from Treasure and Enix. This one's also 64 meg, 1 or 2 players, and out in Japan in June. Again, no UK date, naturally. It's a platform shooter where you're rescuing Professor Gumble. They're saying it's got 2D and 3D sections. Sounds a bit like a mix-up. They reckon the visuals are good, which is fair enough from the look of the screens. And there's a little jab about all the Japanese text in one of the screens, bless. The an ear to the ground section is all rumours as usual in the run-up to E3. Tomb Raider 64 is still rumbling on, and they're saying the PlayStation Tomb Raider 2 is looking good, while the N64 version hasn't even started properly. Typical. Bandai and Sega have split up, which means games like Dragon Ball Z, Sailor Moon and Gundam might be heading to the N64, which could be interesting for some folk. Manchester Software Creations are working on Creator and Blade and Barrel, keeping hush-hush as always. Maxis are talking up Simcopter for the N64, promising jazzed-up graphics and loads of cities, and Hudson are showing off Dual Heroes in Japan. Lastly, Capcom are still playing coy about Resident Evil on the N64, saying maybe not, probably just messing us about. E3 will sort it all out, I suppose. This page is about a report from Japan, looking at how things are going in the land of the rising sun for Nintendo 64. It seems like Turok Dinosaur Hunter has just been released there on May 30th. They're calling it a Doom variety game, which is fair enough, that's what we all called them back then, Doom clones essentially. Apparently these types of games haven't always been massive in Japan, unlike RPGs. The reviewer is wondering if Turok will do well over there, as early signs are that Japanese gamers might not be too keen. They're hoping a good marketing push will help, even though Nintendo 64 sales in Japan haven't been amazing since Star Fox 64 came out, which is a bit worrying, isn't it? There's also a mention of Diablo, which is interesting as a PC game, but apparently it's doing well in Japan and is even in their PC top 10 games. They think Diablo would be welcomed on the N64, which is a thought. Down the bottom, there's a bit about Kogyaru magazines and Japanese street culture, seemingly aimed at trendy high school girls. They're dyeing their hair brown, getting fake tans and wearing loose socks, whatever they are. Apparently this culture is behind the Tamagotchi craze and Print Club, which must be those photo booth things that were getting popular back then. It's all about keeping up with the fashion, isn't it? Seems like a whole different world over there. This page is a bit of a mixed bag really. We've got a big question on whether Nintendo are going to flex their muscles, which is all about the release of Star Wars, Shadows of the Empire on the N64 in Japan. Apparently it's out, but they're not exactly shouting about it, are they? It talks about how Star Wars games on the PlayStation, like Dark Forces and Rebel Assault 2, didn't exactly set Japan on fire, despite being popular in the States. They're wondering if Nintendo can change that rule, and if Japanese gamers will take to Star Wars on the N64. The article mentions Nintendo's PR department saying their big promotion is cinema adverts, and that's about it apparently. Bit underwhelming if you ask me. Then there's a Nintendo short about a multi-racing glowing Game Boy. Sounds a bit gimmicky, doesn't it? Apparently it's painted with glow-in-the-dark paint, and if you leave it in the sun for 10 minutes it will glow for 8 hours. It's a prize for a competition linked to Imagineer's Multi-Racing Championship. Only in Japan, naturally. They only made 2,000 of them and you can't buy them in the shops, you have to enter some competition with Imagineer. Likely to be a collector's item one day, I suppose. Matey. Next up is Tamagotchi for the Game Boy, accompanied by a caring guide. Seems Tamagotchi is still massive, especially with Japanese schoolgirls, the Kogyaru they call them. Magazines like Egg and Kawaii are all over this Kogyaru thing apparently. And even proper fashion magazines like 17 and Fine are jumping on the bandwagon. This Game Boy Tamagotchi is coming out in Japan at the end of July as a set with the game and a pink Game Boy cartridge, plus a guidebook. Sounds like a lot of pink. YI. On the right-hand side of the page is a massive advert for the ultimate sound system. All in yellow and black. Very dramatic. It's about Dolby Digital coming to home systems, making your lounge sound better than the local multiplex. They've got a bit about the Mile High Club, and driving ambitions, which I'm guessing are articles in the magazine itself, something about tall buildings and car tech, and then a plus section mentioning interactive TV, DVD players, digital cameras, Japanese gadgets and even remote control flying saucers. Bit futuristic for 97, isn't it? Finally, at the bottom, there's an advert for T3 issue 9, promising to show us how the digital revolution will change our lives. All for £2.95. Blimey. Magazines were a bit pricey back then, weren't they? This page is from the mag, and kicks off with a new column called An Englishman in Japan by Max Everingham. Sounds like he's our man over there keeping us in the loop about what's going on gaming-wise. He's starting with a quick Japanese lesson, which is handy I suppose, talking about kanji, hiragana and katakana. All different writing systems apparently. He reckons katakana is the one we'd need if we're ever off to Japan for games, and the word to know is, which is game in Japanese. The main article is about Akihabara in Tokyo. Max is properly excited about it, calling it the Kama Sutra of technology. Bit much maybe, but he's saying it's like Tottenham Court Road but massive, and packed with all the newest games. Seems like the place to be if you're a gamer in Japan. Then there's a bit about Tamagotchi, those little virtual pets everyone was going mad for back then. He jokes about bacon and eggs, and pixelated puppies and eggs, a bit odd. Says everyone was trying to get hold of a Tamagotchi, and it was a massive craze even in Japan, same as here really. There's a picture of one of those Tamagotchis, with 627 reborn on the screen. Could be a release date or something. And another picture showing it next to a Game Boy, probably to show how small they are. He finishes by saying Tamagotchi is coming to the Game Boy soon, so you'll get another bite of that egg craze. Sounds like he's well on the Tamagotchi hype train. Maybe a bit too enthusiastic for my liking, but they were quite popular, weren't they? This page in Arena, brings back memories. Right in your face is Mario Kart 64, looking all shiny and new. You can see Mario, Donkey Kong, Peach, Bowser, and even Toad flying around in the background. It's flagged up as an import, so this is back when we were all chomping at the bit to get our hands on the Japanese version months before it came out here. Doo-doo. Then underneath, there's War Gods, with some bloke in a loincloth. They're asking if Midway, of all people, have made a 3D beat-em-up to make up for, and I quote, boring old KI and MK. Bit cheeky that, but yeah, by 97 we were probably getting a bit tired of the same old Killer Instinct to Mortal Kombat formula. Wonder if War Gods actually delivered though? Probably not if I'm honest. This page is all about the new hotness, and back then Mario Kart 64 was definitely the one to watch. This page in Arena takes us back to July 97. It's all about the reviews, innit? First off, finally, Mario Kart 64 is out in the UK. Took its sweet time, didn't it? Apparently, even with the usual PL conversion quirks, it's supposed to be a cracker. Chuku. Then there's Mortal Kombat Trilogy. They've given it a 48, which, reading their scoring guide, sounds a bit pants. Seems like they think it's for beat-em-up completists only, and dragged through a hedge backwards and forwards. Ouch. Doesn't sound like a must-have then. You can see Scorpion and Shang Tsung scrapping in a screenshot there, looking as digitized as ever. Dirt? On the other hand, Kabuki Joe got an 88. Blimey, that's a decent score. Must be alright then. Press start, it says next to it, which is helpful. Never heard of Kabuki Joe to be honest, but 88 is a solid score in this mag. Looking at their scoring system, 85% and above is top notch. Star game material apparently, must be proper good. 7,084% is still good, like Super Mario 64 and Mario Kart 64, which makes sense. 5,069% is playable and moderately entertaining. And anything below 50%? Well, they reckon it's a disservice to the N64. Crikey. 0.19% is apparently something they hope to never see. Dramatic. They also explain what they score on visuals, sounds, mastery, and lifespan. Makes sense. And there's a bit about playing import games, saying you'll need a Japanese or American machine or a modified UK one to play games from abroad. Importing games was a bit of a faff back then, wasn't it? All in all, a typical Arena page, giving us the lowdown on what to play and what to avoid on our brand new N64. This page is all about the big one, Mario Kart 64 finally hitting the UK. They're really pushing it, saying it's been more eagerly awaited than the relief of Mafeking, which is a bit much, isn't it? You've got a picture of Mario and Luigi grinning away in their karts. Classic Mario style, bright colours and all that. There's a little box that tells you it's for the Nintendo 64 obviously, and it's 96 megs, whatever that means really, but sounds impressive I suppose. Says it's for 1 to 4 players, and you can save your progress, either on the cartridge or a controller pack, fancy that. And it's £60. Which was a hefty chunk of change back then for a game, but hey, it's Mario Kart. Big letters at the bottom just spell out Mario Kart, in case you missed it. Pretty simple page really, just telling you to go and buy it. This page is all about Mario Kart 64, blimey, remember when this was coming out? It's got Toad looking rather pleased with himself in his car. They're showing off some of the crazy bits in the game, like dodging trains, negotiating a flock of penguins, avoiding dinosaur eggs, and even bumping down a red carpeted staircase. Which is a bit daft really. And of course popping balloons. Classic Mario Kart style chaos. The screenshots give you a glimpse of the N64 graphics we were all supposed to be amazed by back then, even if they look a bit chunky now. Still, looked like a good bit of fun, probably was the must-have game at the time. This page delves into Mario Kart 64, breaking down how it all fits together on the Nintendo 64. Right at the top, it's talking about Grand Prix mode, which is proper single player, or 2-player action. You pick your racer and take on 7 computer-controlled karts, in a series of races across cups, like the Mushroom Cup, or Flower Cup. It explains you have to come in 4th or better to progress and get your gold, silver or bronze, depending on your performance. They mention you can choose 50cc, 100cc, or 150cc carts, which changes the speed and how tough the computer opponents are. The reviewer seems to think it's good, saying it's highly entertaining and you need a mix of driving skill and using items, but they also think it's a bit too easy, especially on 150cc, if you play with a mate. Then it moves on to versus mode, for when you've got a few mates around, 2, 3 or 4 players. Apparently in this mode, the computer racers vanish, which makes sense, as the N64 was probably struggling enough with 4 real players on screen. Instead, to make up for the lack of computer opponents, they've thrown in these yellow bomb things that bounce around the track. Sounds a bit chaotic, but they reckon it's more about racing your mates directly and choosing any track you fancy, instead of going through cups in order. They say with 4 players, it's the most fun you can have, describing it as tires squealing and red shells flying everywhere, and controllers getting thrown about. Which sounds about right for a good Mario Kart session back in the day. They do note the screen gets a bit smaller with multiple players, and some graphical details are lost, but apparently it doesn't spoil the fun. This page is all about Mario Kart 64, showing off 2 of the main modes. First up is Battle Mode, you know, the one where you try and pop your mates' balloons. They're saying it's a step up from the Super Mario Kart version on the SNES, with 3D arenas now and up to 4 players causing mayhem. Sounds about right for the N64. Apparently they reckon the arenas are a bit big, and you spend too much time driving around not seeing anyone. Bit harsh, it's still a laugh with a few mates, isn't it? Oh. Then there's Time Trial Mode, the single player bit. They're raving about it being proper long-term fun, trying to beat your best times. It's all about pure driving skill apparently, no power-ups getting in the way. They mention power sliding being key, which, yeah, if you wanted to shave off those milliseconds you had to get good at that. And ghosts, proper cool feature that, racing against yourself, or your mate's best time if you had a controller pack. They even give some example times for Luigi Raceway, Mario Raceway, and Royal Raceway. 2 minutes 10 seconds on Luigi Raceway? Blimey, that's not hanging about. This page is all about Mario Kart 64 then, innit? Right, so it kicks off with 8 of a kind, talking about the original racers from Super Mario Kart on the SNES, saying they're all back for this N64 outing, except for poor old Koopa Troopa who's been replaced by Wario. Lucky him, eh? Chew. Then it groups the characters. You got your light lot Yoshi, Princess Daisy, and Toad. Apparently they're nippy around corners and good for time trials, although they reckon they get barged about a bit in Grand Prix, probably by the bigger lads. Daisy's apparently a bit miffed about not getting picked much, bless her. Next up it's the Mario brothers, Mario and Luigi, the middle ranking karters. Not too hard to handle, not too fast or anything, just Tesha. Middle of the road really. They reckon they're decent for beginners on Mario Kart 64, but the serious players don't bother with them too much. Atalia. Underneath that, there's a section called Kart Customizing, which is a fancy way of saying power-ups, I suppose. It's all about how vital they are in Grand Prix and that. Then it runs through a load of the items you can pick up. You've got your banana, simple enough, drop it behind you, spin people out. Then the banana bunch, which you can scatter behind you if no one's following. Green shells, fire them forwards, classic. Red shells are smarter, they go for whoever's in front. Triple shells, well 3 shells, green and red. Spin around you for a bit of defense, then you can fire them off one by one. Spiny shell, the blue one. Ultimate weapon. Chases down the leader, noisy thing too apparently. Mushrooms, for a speed boost. Good for quick starts or shortcuts. And lastly, the fake item box. Looks like a power-up, but it's a trap for anyone daft enough to grab it. Brubby. There's a screenshot showing someone in 3rd place on a track. Looks like a race in progress. Yeah, pretty standard Mario Kart fare. Power-ups and karting. Good times back then, wasn't it? This page from N64 Magazine back in '97, it's all about Mario Kart 64, as you can see from the top right there with Mario Kart 64. It kicks off with a bit about Donkey Kong, Wario and Bowser, describing them as the evil characters, and they are a bit slow to get going, which is fair enough, being the bigger lads, but once they are up to speed they are hard to stop. Apparently they are a bit rubbish at corners though, which is maybe why I could sometimes beat them. It suggests using a turbo start with them, pressing A as the last light comes on, which was a handy tip back in the day. K. Then it moves on to kart technique, breaking down the controls. The Z trigger is for using power-ups, and a trick if you have shells is that tapping Z puts them behind you as defense, which is quite clever. The R button is for jumping or drifting being key to get round those corners faster. Remember trying to master that. L button cycles music, which is not exactly vital gameplay info, but okay. The analog joystick steers obviously, and if you pull back and hold B in the air it stops you bouncing. Useful for some of the jump sections. A is accelerate, B's break, simple enough. A plus B together spins you around if you get stuck, which we all did at some point. The right C button cycles the display speedo, map, and positions, which is alright. Bottom C is the same as Z trigger for power-ups. Top C switches camera angle to a zoomed-out view, better for Grand Prix they reckon. Start pauses the game, no surprises there. And it finishes with drift cornering, saying it's vital to master it, pressing R and accelerator as you go into a corner, and wiggling the stick, all classic stuff for getting those boost starts out of drifts. Finally, there's a power-up tips section, saying you have to wait a few seconds for your power-up to be selected after you grab a box, or you can speed it up by pressing Z again. Never knew that. It also moans about always getting rubbish green shells and bananas in first place, which is just how the game is, isn't it? And it mentions shells and bananas can be held behind you as shields using Z, which is mentioned again from earlier. It's all pretty basic stuff if you played it a lot, but handy for someone just picking it up, I suppose. This page from N64 Mag, right? It's a course guide for Mario Kart 64, classic game that was. It's covering the Mushroom Cup, so we're looking at Luigi Raceway and Moo Moo Farm. What is it? Luigi Raceway, bless it, they call it a gentle introduction. It's a simple track, alright. A bit of a loop really, proper Formula 1 style they reckon, whatever that means in Mario Kart. They're pointing out where the item boxes are, saying about using a superstar or triple mushrooms to cut across the sand, and banging on about drifting, as if we didn't all try to master that back then. Apparently there's a tunnel too, for a bit of visual distraction, or maybe to make you lose speed if you muck it up. Then it's Moo Moo Farm, a bit more basic this one, fields and fences and those pesky moles. They are a pain, popping up and sending you flying. Though, if you got a star or boo, you could just plow right through 'em, happy days. They're saying about putting bananas near the moles to catch people out. Sneaky. And they're debunking a shortcut rumor about the bridges. Typical magazine stuff. Always gotta be the fun police. Still, good memories this game, wasn't it? Simple times. This page, right then, is all about shaving those precious seconds off your Mario Kart 64 time trial records. We've got a couple of tracks featured here, Luigi Raceway, Koopa Troopa Beach, and Calimari Desert. For Luigi Raceway, they're aiming for a 2 minutes and 6 seconds .75, which sounds fairly nippy. Koopa Troopa Beach, they reckon you can crack in 1 minute 55.34. And Calimari Desert, that train track one, they've got a target of 1 minute 53.3. Oi. They've got these little numbered boxes with tips for each track. For Koopa Troopa Beach, they're pointing out a shortcut through a waterfall, saying you can jump it even without a superstar or mushroom, which is handy to know. There's another tip about a power-up on a grassy bit, and another shortcut through a sandy bit with crabs, which sounds charmingly hazardous. And then there's the classic palm tree clump that sends you flying if you're not careful. Always a right pain that was crabs. A grassy bit. For Calimari Desert, it's all about the train, naturally. They're saying the train's pretty quick, so you'll probably have to stop for it at least once on each lap, which is a bit of a drag. Tip number 2 is about keeping an eye out for both crossings, so you don't get caught out. And tip 3 is about mastering the drifting around the corners, which is fair enough in Calimari, you need all the mini turbos you can get there. Power-ups are a bit random on that track too apparently, a bit of a lottery in Grand Prix mode. So yeah, just some helpful hints for getting faster times on Mario Kart 64, pretty standard stuff for the time really. This page is all about the Flower Cup in Mario Kart 64, focusing on 2 tracks, Toad's Turnpike and Frappe Snowland. First up is Toad's Turnpike. They're calling it Kino Pio Highway, originally, which sounds a bit poncy to be honest. It's described as a busy motorway, which is definitely right what with all the cars knocking you about. Apparently getting good at it is a fraught business for beginners, which is a bit dramatic, it's just Mario Kart. They're saying power-ups are hidden in roadside laybys and are a bit trickier to get to. The tip is to swoop into the lay-by, drop a banana, and grab all the power-ups. Sounds like a decent sneaky tactic. They also mention power sliding around bends for extra speed, even with all the traffic, which is fair enough, you've got to get any edge you can on this track, it's a bit of a wiggle fest otherwise. Oh, and they've had to explain what a turnpike is to us Brits using the N64 dictionary. US motorway where you pay tolls. Well, thanks for that, very helpful. Then there's Frappe Snowland, which is a straightforward ice track, bit marbly looking. They mention snowmen that don't really get in the way, but you can cut across the snowbanks if you've got mushrooms, handy for time trials they reckon. First tip is about bananas on a bridge, classic stuff. Then they talk about the snowmen again, saying to pick a straight line and stick to it rather than weaving through them, which is probably solid advice. There's a mention of a giant snow Mario, and a bit of a dodgy Raymond Briggs reference about it coming to life. A bit random that. Power sliding around a long corner is tip number 4, obviously. And finally, if you've got a mushroom, zoom across somewhere to save a second or two. Groundbreaking stuff. Overall, it's your typical track guide really. Nothing too revolutionary, but probably helpful enough back in the day, when we were all still figuring out the best way to power slide and not get mullered by a blue shell. This page in N64 Mag is all about Mario Kart 64, which was a bit of a system seller back then, wasn't it? It's focusing on time trial mode, and giving you some pointers for beating the staff ghosts on a couple of tracks. Sure. First up is Choco Mountain, which they say is 687 meters long. It's got a bit of a brown color scheme, as they point out, very observant of them. The tips are pretty basic really, like watch out for tumbling boulders. Cheers for that, very helpful. And there's a tiny tunnel apparently, that's interesting. Frapp Snowland is the time to beat for that course, 2 minutes, 17 seconds and 57 hundredths of a second. Blimey, precise. Then there's Mario Raceway. A slightly shorter 567 meters they reckon. This one's supposed to be the Circuit of Conquering Heroes. Bit dramatic, isn't it? They talk about a shortcut, power sliding around the hairpin, and using mushrooms to cut across the grass. Mario Raceway's target time is 1 minute 32 seconds and 88 hundredths. Right then, challenge accepted. The screenshots show the usual kart racers Mario, Luigi, Peach, Toad, Yoshi, Donkey Kong, Wario and Bowser all battling it out, looking quite blocky but still charming in that N64 way. There's also some turbo start advice, telling you to press A at the right time between the lights, and apparently, even after Lakitu fishes you out of the water you can get a turbo. Useful info I suppose if you're constantly falling in. Good times, simple pleasures. This page in N64 Magazine is having a look at the Star Cup tracks in Mario Kart 64. We're talking about Wario Stadium and Sherbet Land here, both pretty iconic tracks if you ask me. Norse? First up is Wario Stadium. They're saying it's a long track, which it definitely is, feels like it goes on forever sometimes. Apparently it's great for power sliding if you can actually manage to power slide properly. Back then it was always a bit hit and miss, wasn't it? They point out the overhead TV screens, which were a nice touch to show you the action across the stadium. There's a mention of a tricky shortcut. Jumping over a wall sounds about right for Mario Kart to have some crazy little exploit like that, although they admit it's unreliable and only really worth trying in time trial. And they mention the bumpy bits on the track. Yeah, those were definitely stomach churning if you hit them wrong. Power-ups being vital for this track is a given really in Mario Kart. Cheshuku. Then there's Sherbet Land. This one's described as for experts, slippery ice and penguins. Spot on. That ice was lethal, sending you spinning all over the place. They warn about falling into the water and getting frozen in ice by Lakitu. Remember that cheeky fella? The cave full of penguins, yeah, that was always a nightmare, dodging those little blighters as they waddled around. They suggest studying the penguins' movements to figure out the best way through, which is probably good advice if you had the patience. And they mention hopping over the water on the corners, another way to shave off a bit of time if you were brave enough to try it. Scatter bananas at the cave entrance, classic Mario Kart move to ruin someone's day. Good times, frustrating times, all part of the fun back in '97. This page shows a guide for Mario Kart 64 time trials, focusing on Royal Raceway and Bowser's Castle. Right then, Royal Raceway's target time is a rather ambitious 3 minutes and 7 seconds, and they call it a test of driving excellence. Bit much, isn't it? They mention it's got power slide aroundable corners, and even that you can visit Princess Peach's castle, though sadly not go inside, which is a bit of a tease. The tips are the usual stuff: power sliding, hopping over the grass, and using thunderbolts wisely. There's a tip about a jump over water that sounds a bit iffy, likely to end in a Lakitu rescue. Daddy. Yo. Then we move on to Bowser's Castle, with a target time of 2 minutes 36 seconds. They're really hyping up the graphics for this one, saying it's stunning. Which for the time, I suppose it was pretty good. Thwomps are mentioned as a blessed nuisance, which is a fair description, always getting in the way. Tips include power sliding around the garden and castle, and avoiding falling into the lava, naturally. There's something about bumping down steps being amusing, and a banana skin trick near a spiral section. Sounds like the usual Mario Kart chaos then. Not bad for a quick guide I suppose, if you were struggling to shave off those seconds. This page from N64 Magazine is giving us the lowdown on 2 tracks from what must be Mario Kart 64 I reckon, Donkey Kong Jungle Parkway and Yoshi Valley. They're calling it a special cup feature, which is probably just fancy talk for track guides. For Donkey Kong Jungle Parkway, they're going on about avoiding monkeys throwing coconuts, power sliding like it's going out of fashion, and some shortcut near the finish line. Number 7 tip is about jumping over the bridge railing, which sounds a bit risky for my liking but apparently saves time. They're showing a little map of the track, looks like your typical jungle setting, bit brown and green. Then for Yoshi Valley they're talking about safe routes and courageous routes, suggesting there are multiple paths. Spinies are mentioned, which, knowing my luck, I'll probably crash into. Apparently there's a giant Yoshi egg rolling around causing trouble. Sounds like a bit of a gimmick if you ask me. They're saying the shortest route is tricky because of spinies, but that's always the way, isn't it? Go figure. Both tracks have got these little numbered tips and screenshots, showing the game in action. It's all pretty standard stuff for a game guide back then, not exactly groundbreaking, but probably helpful for getting a leg up on your mates down the pub on a Friday night. This page is about getting quicker times in Mario Kart 64, focusing on time trial mode. They've picked two tracks, Banshee Boardwalk and Rainbow Road, giving tips on how to shave seconds off your lap times. Banshee Boardwalk, they say it's a terror to drive, what with the rotting wood and haunted houses, which is a bit dramatic for a cartoon racing game, isn't it? Tips include hopping over a hole in the floor, which apparently saves a minute amount of time, bit of an exaggeration there I reckon. And they mention the bats slow you down, which is hardly news. They also tell you to power slide around bends, like we didn't already know that's the way to go fast in Mario Kart. Paxa. Then there's Rainbow Road, the long one that goes on forever in space. It's 2,000 meters apparently, makes it sound epic, doesn't it? Tip for this one is a shortcut at the start, and to watch out for those chomping chain chomps. Again, power sliding is mentioned as key, and to watch out for bananas, which are hard to see on the colourful track. Solid advice, I suppose, if a bit basic for anyone who's played the game for more than 5 minutes. Still, Mario Kart 64 was brilliant fun back then, hours wasted with mates trying to beat each other, and probably still is now to be fair. This page from N64 Magazine issue 4 is all about Mario Kart 64, proper N64 launch title classic, that one. It's got a section called N64 Arena, and is giving us the top 5 multiplayer courses, and top 5 time trial courses. For multiplayer, Koopa Troopa Beach is number 1, described as cheerful holiday racing, followed by Sherbet Land, Bowser's Castle, Donkey Kong's Jungle Parkway, and Royal Raceway. Apparently Royal Raceway is good for weeding out amateurs, with its tricky corners at the end. Slaker. Then there's the time trial top 5, which is interesting. Mario Raceway is top, followed by Koopa Troopa Beach again, Royal Raceway again, Luigi Raceway, and Frappe Snowland. Seems like Koopa Troopa Beach and Royal Raceway are popular tracks then, for both multiplayer and time trials. But the article itself talks about what to expect from Mario Kart 64, going on about how it's more than just getting a car and scenery, like in Ridge Racer or Daytona USA on the Saturn and PlayStation. It mentions the subtle handling, and the computer-controlled racers with their own personalities. Which is a bit of a stretch, to be honest, they just cheat, don't they? It mentions different game modes like Grand Prix, Versus, Time Trial, and Battle Mode for up to 4 players. They reckon it's a bit overwhelming but exciting, like getting an inside look at what they, N64 Magazine, have been up to since they got their hands on the Japanese version. Bit cheeky there. Moriting, there's a section on one-player Grand Prix racing, saying it took them a couple of evenings to get gold cups and a few more hours for the reverse mode cups. They found the tracks are well designed and fun, but the AI in Grand Prix can be a bit repetitive because they always seem to be trying to let Donkey Kong win. Bit of a conspiracy theory there. They complain about Donkey Kong getting in front every race, even if you use shortcuts and power-ups. Bit melodramatic if you ask me, it's just a game, innit? Warrington. Then it goes on about 2-player Grand Prix racing, with a mate called John visiting the office and playing split screen. They say the frame rate slows down a bit, but it's still good fun, and you can work together against the computer. Finally, there's a section on multiplayer racing in general, saying real humans are much better than the computer. It talks about the power-ups and shortcuts making it entertaining, and reckons it's worth investing more time in. Plus there's a little mirror mode tip saying if you get gold on all 150 C-cups you unlock mirror mode where all the tracks are flipped. Sounds like a right head melt. There are a few screenshots dotted around, showing the game in action, with the karts racing and bits of track. Overall, it's a pretty standard preview type piece, not getting too carried away, but clearly liking Mario Kart 64 as you would. It was Mario Kart on the N64 after all, bound to be good, wasn't it? This page in N64 Magazine back in '97 is all about Mario Kart 64. The UK version has finally landed. They're checking out how it compares to the Japanese import, and seem a bit miffed right off the bat about the black borders on the screen. Not as bad as Wave Race 64 they say, but still not ideal. Apparently the speed is a bit slower on the PL version we get over here, and lap times are longer. Price is mentioned, 60 quid, which they think is a bit steep. And there's some weirdness with having to reset the console if you pause in multiplayer. Bit of a pain. They're not too chuffed with the battle mode either, say the arenas are too big and it's a bit dull, more about hiding than battling it out. Time trial mode though they're loving, reckon it's brilliant for shaving off those seconds. Visually it gets an 8, calling it a stunning 3D world for a racer. Sounds also get an 8, with cheery music and amusing effects, can't argue with that. Mastery gets a 9, loads to do, even with 4-player split screen, though they have a dig at the PL conversion again. Lifespan gets a 9 too, courses could be more varied, but mastering it all is going to take a while. There are some multiplayer tips as well, telling you to pick heavier characters like Donkey Kong and Bowser, to barge people off course, especially at the start, and to watch out for what power-ups you get, depending on where you are in the race, which is always handy to know. They give the game a 91% in the verdict, calling it months of racing fun packed into a crab-sized cartridge, which is a bit of an odd way to put it. Overall they seem to rate it, even if they're grumbling about the usual PL conversion issues we always seem to get stuck with. This page is about getting faster at Mario Kart 64, specifically on Mario Raceway, in N64 Arena Magazine. It's a bit of a masterclass, or at least that's what they're calling it, in 8 steps. Apparently Mario Raceway is where all the top players compete, so if you want bragging rights down the pub, this is your track. Misu. The first step is picking your character. They reckon for Grand Prix you want a heavy character like Donkey Kong or Wario, you know, for barging. But for time trials, precision is key, so they suggest Princess Daisy or Toad. Bit of a weird choice, Toad. Then it's all about learning the track, which, yeah, obviously. Spend some time getting to know the bends and twists. They even talk about drifting a bit fancy for Mario Kart 64 back then, wasn't it? Target time for just learning the track is a leisurely 2 minutes 2 seconds. Giveaway. Next up is the turbo start. This is easy enough. Nail the timing of the lights and you're off like a rocket. Target time for that is 1 minute 59 seconds. Not much improvement, to be honest. Finally, they're talking about hopping. Repeatedly tapping the R button around corners so you don't skid. Sounds a bit frantic, but they say it's good for the sharpest bends like the hairpin. Target time with hopping is 1 minute 50 seconds. Nearly 10 seconds faster just by hopping. Blimey, it's a pretty basic guide really, but back then, any tips on shaving seconds off your time were gold dust when you were trying to beat your mates. Good times, eh? This page is all about getting faster times in Mario Kart 64, specifically on Luigi Raceway. It's a right deep dive into time trials, something we all messed about with back in the day, trying to shave off those precious seconds. They're walking you through a few steps, starting with using your mushrooms wisely. Apparently the best spot is right near the end of the course, skipping across the grass. Classic shortcut stuff, eh? Then it gets into power sliding, which, yeah, we all tried to master that. It was always a bit hit and miss, wasn't it? Wiggling the joystick about like mad to get those mini turbos. They reckon Luigi Raceway is good for practicing it as it has long bends. Makes sense. Warrington. Next up they're talking about cutting corners, and it gets a bit cheeky here. They call it exploiting Mario Raceway's secret shortcut, which is basically just jumping over walls and landing where you shouldn't really be. Step 7 is about jumping over a wall near the hairpin bend with a mushroom. They make it sound blooming hard, saying it needs skill and luck, and getting it 3 times in a row is a near miracle. Bit dramatic, lads, but they do give a target time of 1 minute 32 seconds for that section. Then there's shortcut 2, which sounds even more ludicrous. Landing on the right of the wall instead of the left, apparently 100 times harder. They reckon if you get that nailed you can get times under a minute, which, blimey, that would have been impressive. World record back then was apparently 51 seconds .94, held by some Japanese player. Mental. They even mention times reported by US and Japanese karters who've perfected this, translating to under 1 minute 12 for PL versions. Proper tryhards some people, weren't they? But fair play, if they could pull that off. It was all about bragging rights down the youth club, wasn't it, Briggy? The page ends congratulating you if you've broken the 1 minute 47 barrier, and mentions Mario himself appears to race against you. Bit of a flex there, Nintendo. They reckon there's still more work to be done though, always chasing those faster times, eh? Good times, good times. This page looks like a review, reckon it's about Mortal Kombat trilogy on the N64. Remember all the fuss about Mortal Kombat back then? Well, this article seems a bit cynical about it on the old N64. They're asking if it's just a cash-in, which is a bit harsh, innit? Kantaka. Seems they're comparing it to the PlayStation version and even the old SNES Ultimate Mortal Kombat. Apparently the N64 version isn't all that amazing, graphically a bit rougher than the PlayStation one, and they moan about slowdown and sound issues. One bit says it looks like, your dad at a disco, cheeky, new. They mention aggressor mode, which sounds a bit naff. It's compared unfavorably to Killer Instinct Gold. Now that was a proper game, remember? And they also mention other beat-em-ups coming out like Mace, Dark Rift and Struggle Hard, saying they might be better. So yeah, not exactly a rave review for Mortal Kombat Trilogy on the N64, more like a meh, it's alright I suppose kind of vibe. They were a tough crowd at N64 Mag, weren't they? This page then, it's all about Mortal Kombat Trilogy on the N64. Yeah, you remember they threw pretty much every character and stage they could think of into one game. There are screenshots all over the place, Jade kicking ass, Reptile being his usual stinky self, Liu Kang doing his heart rip trick, and Scorpion showing off his brutal finishing moves. They're even banging on about the fatalities and all that gore, saying it's the same old body-ripping stuff, which, yeah, it kind of was by then. They've got a bit of a moan about things in beat-em-ups they don't like, things like a commentator that shouts fighter names too loud, fighters using guns, and stupid names like Noob Saibot and Jax. Fair enough, some of it was a bit daft even back then. Palba. They've rated it out of 100%, and it's got a pretty low score, 34%. They reckon the visuals are only just okay, because of the transparencies, the sounds are rubbish, and there's no real mastery to it. Lifespan is apparently alright, but overall they're saying even with 64-bit tech, it's a bit of a letdown and well overrated. Blimey, 34%, that's a bit harsh innit? Still, maybe they had a point, it was getting a bit samey by then even for Mortal Kombat. This page delves into the realm of import games, you know, back when getting your hands on stuff from Japan and the States was a bit of a faff but always intriguing. It's all about War Gods this time, blimey what a name, eh? Once more into the theatre of pain, dear friends. Bit dramatic, aren't we? Looks like your typical beat-em-up from the screenshots. You've got your Kabuki Joe bloke looking a bit scary, and some chap called Anubis throwing shapes. They're showing off some of the character select screen as well. Warhead and CY5 are in there, and Voodoo, naturally. Apparently if you're clever you can pull off a 10-hit combo, which sounds like a right pain to master, especially with the slower characters like Big Boy Tak. They mention his boulder roll move, which they reckon is always good for a laugh. Right then. Down at the bottom there's a little info box for War Gods from Midway. Says it's already out in the US, and we can expect it in September here in the UK. It's a 64 meg cartridge, for 1 or 2 players, and needs the controller pack and rumble pack, naturally to feel those hits. Gonna set you back $80, which they reckon is about 50 quid. Ouch. Remember when games actually cost that much? Oh, and there's a random comment about blue shorts being better than green skirts for freedom of movement. Right you are then. Always some insightful commentary in these mags, eh? This page of N64 Mag is all about War Gods. Seems like Midway are really pushing this one. We get a look at some screenshots, showing off characters like Anubis, Voodoo, Warhead and Pagan battling it out. Very much in that Mortal Kombat style, you can see the blood splatters and all that jewel. They've got this odd thing called War God's predicted life cycle, going through the game's birth at day 0 when it's just come out of the packaging, all the way to death, a couple of days later when everyone's bored of it and moved on to the next big thing, which is probably pretty accurate to be honest. They've got these little life stage descriptions, quite funny really, like excitement, interest, creeping unease, mounting worry, dawning realization, depression, desperation, and finally second-hand shop. Bit cynical, but maybe true for some games back then. Roya. There's also a cheat sheet bit, for those who can't manage without a leg up, telling you how to get a cheat menu and play as Grox, who sounds like one of the bosses. They say to use the D-pad for the cheat codes, as the analog stick can be a bit hit and miss. Which is fair enough, those early analog sticks weren't always the most precise, were they? The reviewer reckons it's good to see Midway haven't held back on the blood, and that it adds to the Mortal Kombat feel, so they're clearly aiming for that market. And there's a quote about Kabuki Joe doing a Ring of Fires move, and he's just that kinda guy, whatever that means. Kurthwack and Where's He Gone are also mentioned, maybe some in-game sound effects or character quotes. Overall, it's a bit of a preview piece, trying to build up some hype for War Gods, but in that slightly sarcastic magazine way we were used to. This page then, right, it's got a feature called Time to Meet the Freaks. Bit sensational, isn't it? It's all about the game War Gods from Midway, you know, the Mortal Kombat lot. They're banging on about character design, saying if you wanted a guide to fighting game cliches, War Gods is your go-to. Apparently they've got the fat bloke, Tak, who's slow but strong, then 2 scantily clad ladies, Vala and Pagan, very tasteful for 97, not really, who are quick but weak. And then your action heroes, Maximus and Warhead. Sounds original, doesn't it? Yeah. They've got profiles of 6 of the characters. CY5, who's like a robot geezer with lasers and electric shots, apparently he's a bit weak. Maximus is supposed to be like a transformer, bit of a bruiser. Warhead, well he's all about missiles and a quake punch, sounds subtle. Then there's Pagan, a female fighter, apparently she likes showing off if she wins. Ah how kin is a bloke in a skirt Scottish, and voila another woman who's got this move where she punches someone in an alligator's skull. Charming. Each character profile has a list of their moves, like missiles for Warhead is down, back, low punch, or skeleton trap for Pagan is back, down, back, forward, low punch. There's also basic moves that are the same for everyone, like flying punch and crouching ankle kick. They've even got combo starters and basic finishers and ring specials. Seems a bit complicated in it. The reviewer is having a bit of a dig, saying War Gods is like a reasonable 3D fighting engine trying to be Mortal Kombat 4, but it ended up being a poor man's MK trilogy. They say it's got a gloomy atmosphere, loads of gore and fatalities, but it's all a bit tedious. They reckon the similarities to Mortal Kombat are a bad thing, calling it rubbish unfortunately. Ouch. Still, it's another fighter for the N64, isn't it? We'll probably end up playing it anyway. This page in N64 Magazine back in '97 is having a look at War Gods. Remember that one? It's got a big splash of character profiles and move lists. You've got Anubis, the dog-headed fella, Voodoo with his spooky vibes, Fungus the bogeyman, bit of an oddball that one, and then Kabuki Joe and Tak. They've all got their special moves laid out, like Force Field for Exor and Bitch Slap for Voodoo. Charming. The screenshots are pretty blurry, standard for the N64 days really, showing off the in-game action. Warrentor. The reviewer, James, seems a bit underwhelmed by War Gods, comparing it to Mortal Kombat but not in a good way. He reckons it's a bit of a letdown, no real thrill of discovery. Says the graphics are amateurish and disappointingly lowers, which, yeah, looking back, they were. Sound is apparently hilarious, with Kabukijo's voice being the phrase of the month. Kabukijo we NNSS. Mastery and lifespan aren't rated highly either. Day 1 entry to the critical list. Ouch. Verdict at the bottom is pretty brutal, a 46% score. They're saying Killer Instinct sprites are way more fun than War Gods polygons. Strong words. They suggest playing Killer Instinct instead. Ouch again. Poor War Gods. Didn't get much love, did it? They are saying they'll take another peek for the UK release though, so maybe there's a glimmer of hope, eh? But overall, seems like a bit of a stinker. This page in N64 Magazine is giving us the lowdown on how to master International Superstar Soccer 64, ISS 64 as we used to call it. It's got a big title splashed across the top in that classic N64 style, you know, red and blocky. There's a picture underneath of 4 lads looking well into it, proper glued to the screen, all clutching their N64 controllers. They're all wearing football shirts, which is a bit of a laugh, like they're actually on the pitch themselves. The article itself, by Tim Weaver, it bangs on about the anguish of managing an ISS 64 football team. Bit dramatic, eh? But back then, getting to the World Cup final on that game felt like a genuinely epic quest, didn't it? They're saying there's going to be joy and heartbreak, and that the unpredictability of football is what makes it great. Apparently, to succeed you need to be tactical, skillful, sneaky, and even cheap. Blimey. Sounds about right for trying to beat your mates on ISS 64. It's all very serious about the walk down the tunnel starting here, which is a touch much, but hey, it was the 90s, and we were all about our N64s. ISS 64 was decent back then, wasn't it? Not quite FIFA, but still a good laugh with your mates after school. This page from the magazine is all about getting your tactics sorted before you even kick off in International Superstar Soccer 64. Proper defeat-scented dressing room vibes, as they put it. It's going through the pre-match setup, which back then felt like ages before you actually got to play. The first bit, member, is about picking your team. It's talking about how, even though the game doesn't have position-specific players, there's still a difference between a defender and a midfielder. Common sense, really. They're saying don't worry too much about swapping Neville with Adams, which is a bit of a deep cut for footy fans at the time, but the point is about player stats and roles rather than names. Then there's formation, getting into the nitty-gritty of how you line up. They mention the usual 532, 442, and 352. The reviewer seems to rate the 352, especially if you're using wingbacks, which was a bit trendy back then. They're saying 235 is a bit old hat unless you're taking the mick in the World Cup. You could even move players around individually in the formation, which was quite something for the time, letting you fine-tune things a bit. Finally, strategy is about picking your overall game plan. They list off a bunch of options like all-out defense, counter-attacking, pressing up, wing attacking, and even an offside trap. Apparently, counter-attacking only works if you've got enough strikers. Makes sense. They reckon packing the midfield is good for stifling creative types, and all-out attack or defense are good if you're desperate, which we all were at some point trying to claw back a goal. You could even tell players to join offense, which is a bit of a risky move, but could pay off if you were feeling brave. They mention Gaza-like players for attacking roles, and defensive midfielders for sitting back. Solid advice, really. And if you're lost, There's a role info button to tell you what your player is supposed to be doing, handy if you were just mashing buttons and hoping for the best. This page from N64 Magazine, bless it, is giving us some top tips on how to actually play footy games properly, back in '97 of course. It's all about getting stuck into International Superstar Soccer 64 it seems. First up, it's marking. Apparently, the key is having a sweeper, and not just hoofing the ball upfield like a proper numpty. They're on about picking up runners from midfield, which sounds alright, and putting your centre-backs and frontmen in the right spots. They're even suggesting playing a defensive midfielder if the other team has too many attackers, which is a bit try-hard, isn't it? But fair play, they're trying to get us thinking tactically. Then there's corners, 2 whole ways to score. The first one's a bit fiddly, involving running your player about near the corner flag, and the other is just pinging in an outswinger to the penalty spot. They even mention chipping it in with the left C button, which is fancy for the time. Honestly, just getting it in the box was a win back then. Finally, free kicks. They're saying aim through the wall and into the corner using the B button. Apparently, it's all about the power, depending on how far out you are. 50 to 75% if you're near the penalty box, and a full welly from further out. Sounds like they reckon goals from free kicks should be a doddle after this advice. We'll see about that. All in all, it's a decent enough guide for its time. Probably helped a few of us score a screamer or two back in the day. This page of N64 Magazine from July '97 is all about getting better at International Superstar Soccer 64, which was a bit of alright football game back then, wasn't it? It's got sections on penalties, defending, and even the referees, which is a laugh because you always thought they were a bit dodgy in that game. For penalties, they're saying wait for the shot before diving and just direct the analog stick and press A or B. Seems simple enough. For defending, they talk about remembering things, marking midfielders and using all-out defense if you're struggling. Smart stuff, really. And don't tackle in the box or from behind unless you're absolutely certain, otherwise, penalty. Make or really. The bit on referees is funny. Apparently, there's Hasegawa who is lenient, Hines who lets the game flow, and Carlos who's a card-happy maniac. Sounds about right for football refs, even in games. Then there's win with weak teams, and win with average teams sections. For weak teams like Greece, Japan, South Korea and Cameroon, they recommend formations like 451, 541, or 532 for security at the back. Tap the B button when shooting, and try zigzagging runs to save stamina. And always use 2 defensive midfielders to protect your rubbish keeper. Fair enough advice. For average teams, they list Switzerland, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Belgium, Austria, Wales, Republic of Ireland, Northern Ireland, Poland, South Africa, Mexico, Uruguay, and the USA. They suggest 532, 442 or 443, using wingers for speed and not playing through the center if the other team has a flat back 4. All pretty standard football tactics, even in pixelated form on the N64. It's a decent little guide if you were stuck on ISS 64 back in the day. This page, yeah, it's a how-to guide from N64 Magazine. Always had those, didn't they? This one's about getting wins in a football game by picking the strong teams, listing them out: Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, even Scotland, and then further afield with Nigeria, Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, and all those. It's got move guides, down the wings and through the middle, with formations like 433 and 442. They are going on about button presses, A, B, C, and the C buttons, for through balls and shots, all standard stuff. They even mention using the speed up button, a bit of a cheap tactic, but who's judging? Difficulty-wise, it's supposedly tricky in the penalty area, and they come out with this gem: space not pets wins prizes. Bit of random advice, but there you go. Just typical footy game tips of the time, really. And they reckon one of these moves needs mathematical genius. Bit strong that, wasn't it? This page from the mag is all about tips for International Superstar Soccer 64, proper footy game on the N64, none of this FIFA nonsense back then. Alright Jazz. First up we've got Move C, the long ball, classic hoof it upfield tactic, George Graham style apparently. Says it's not pretty, but effective, especially when you're in a bit of bother. They recommend a 352 formation, and reckon even Stevie Wonder could score with it. Bit harsh on the visually impaired maybe? Then there's Move D, the sweeper, which is all about using your sweeper keeper. Bit risky, but sounds like it could unlock defenses, especially with a 532 formation. They say it's champagne football, but you'll probably just get tackled and look a bit daft. North on the right, there's Sporting Club 64 inches, where the magazine's experts share their preferred players and tactics. We've got Tim from South Africa, likes Carlton as a key player and seems a bit rough, recommending kicking opponents. James from England, naturally goes for Keegan, proper patriotic. Jonathan from Brazil, no surprises there, picks Alejo. Everyone picked Alejo back then, didn't they? Paul from Spain goes for Sanchez and a 541 formation, bit defensive, isn't it? And finally, Will from Mahjong University, which is a bit of a laugh. He likes Yun Pufat and some crazy formation name, sounds like he's not taking it too seriously. All in all, standard footy game tips from back in the day, some of it useful, some of it a bit daft, just like playing ISS 64 with your mates after school. Good times. This page from N64 Magazine, issue 4, takes us right back to 97, doesn't it? It's all about getting a perfect high score on Super Mario 64. Can you believe we were still obsessing over Mario 64 at this point? Mind you, it was pretty revolutionary, so fair enough. The article is framing it as a great coin challenge, saying that just speedrunning the levels isn't the only way to play. Oh no, now we need to be coin collecting obsessives as well. Apparently they're even giving out N64 badges for the best tips, which is a bit of alright. Warrington North, they've got some coin strategies laid out, like knowing where the tricky coins are, finding the health replenishing hearts, and they even admit some levels are just a pain to get every single coin in. Good to know it's not just me then. There's some tip about hitting blocks from underneath to grab coins in mid-air, which is actually a decent shout. I might have actually tried that back then. Warrington Norcus. Then there's this N64 high score table they've put together, calling it, "What, more Mario?" Sarcastic bunch, weren't they? It lists out a load of the Super Mario 64 courses. Bob OMB Battlefield, Hoomps Fortress, Jolly Roger Bay, Cool Cool Mountain, all those classics, with what they reckon is the total coinage, and their N64 high score for each. Looks like they're trying to set the standard for coin collecting, the cheeky sods. Rainbow Ride is down at the bottom there, 164 coins total apparently. Warrants. And just before you get to the bottom there's a little reminder of what they covered previously in N64. Saying last month they showed us how to grab 70 stars fast in Mario. So yeah, classic N64 mag stuff, milking Mario 64 for all it's worth. Can't blame them really, we were all lapping it up. This page from the mag is all about getting a perfect high score in Super Mario 64, which was proper amazing at the time, right? They're running through 3 courses, starting with course 1, Bob Omb's Battlefield. To get a perfect rating of 146 coins, they reckon you need to start from star 3 onwards, because apparently Koopa appears near the flower beds then, and you can use his shell to collect Goombas. Clever, eh? They also give tips on coin rings, wooden posts, and Goombas themselves. Apparently, if you circle wooden posts 3 times they give you coins. Who knew? And they think Mario's punch combo on Goombas is a bit dodgy. Then there's course 2, Thwomp's Fortress, needing 141 coins for perfect. This time, start at star 2 or later. They point out a 1-up at the base of the tower you can get by punching a wall, and warn about piranha plants and hoomps. Apparently if you treat the hoomps right you can get a full 10 coins from them, cheeky blighters. And they mention cork blocks can hold coins too. Lastly, course 3, Jolly Roger Bay, with a perfect rating of 104 coins. Again, start at star 2 so you can use the ship to get red coins, and from star 3 onwards, Unagi the eel might make an appearance. They mention coins around the leftmost spike formation underwater, and a blue switch in a smuggler's cave. All good tips if you were struggling to get every last coin back in 97. This page from N64 Magazine, issue 4 it seems, takes us through some bits and bobs in Super Mario 64, focusing on course 4, Cool Cool Mountain, and course 5, Big Boo's Haunt. For Cool Cool Mountain, they reckon a perfect rating score is 154, and they warn you about the penguins being a nuisance right from the get-go. There's a section on the slide race, pointing out the 82 coins up for grabs, if you include the line above the chimney, which is a fair whack if you were being a completionist back then. They also mention a blue coin you can snag on the first stretch, and using the warp point if you're having a mare of a time with it. Then there's a blue coin on a ledge, near the red coin star marker. And they suggest slide kicks against the spin drifts to get the 3 coins from them, cheeky little things that they are. And finally, a tip on melting a snowman for some coins, though they seem a bit unimpressed with the hotliners on that one, reckon there's a better way. Oh, and triple flipping over some snowmen on the rickety bridge, apparently it's more about confidence than skill, which sounds about right for Mario 64's janky controls sometimes. Moving on to Big Boo's Haunt, the perfect rating is a slightly lower 151. They highlight that the mansion stairs are different after getting star 2, so you might not find all the boos first time round. Apparently there are at least 11 boo buddies in a full house, 6 in the mansion and 5 outside, each worth 10 coins. They suggest using backflips and zen slams to deal with the boo buddies, which was always a bit of a faff to get the timing right. Bookends are also mentioned, those snapping book things. Jump and touch them quick for a blue coin apparently. Red coins are easy enough to spot, and there's a blue switch in the attic, giving you another 20 coins, and they even mention luring out a boo buddy from behind Mr. Eye's panel without needing a vanish cap. And finally, if you're feeling brave, you can try a triple jump and wall kick at the outer cage barrier to reach the roof of the shed for a 1-up mushroom. Bit of a trek for just a mushroom, mind you, but back in '97 we'd try anything to get an extra life, wouldn't we? This page of the magazine dives into Super Mario 64, doesn't it? We're looking at course guides for Hazy Maze Cave and Lethal Lava Land. Right then, Course 6, Hazy Maze Cave has a perfect rating score thing, suggesting you could grab 139 coins, but they reckon 132 is more realistic, blaming some bats and a Mr. Eye, whoever he is. They're almost daring you to prove them wrong. Cheeky. There's advice on enemies like Snuffits, Swoops, and Gophers. Sounds like a right menagerie. Then there's Ceiling Lattice, Blue Switch, and Glitches sections with tips on coins and some cheeky exploits. Apparently loads of little glitches in Super Mario 64, but nothing game-breaking they say, mostly just clipping errors, not exactly earth-shattering stuff. Behind the scenes sounds interesting, talking about shooting to the roof at 120 stars and using a wing cap. Blimey, 120 stars, that's dedication, isn't it? Flipping down we have Course 7, Lethal Lava Land. Perfect rating here is 133, but 131 in practice it seems, and more lava than land apparently. This course is good if you want to grab a Koopa shell and do some Surf City Satan style moves, whatever that means. Need to spin kill a Mr. Eye again in this one too. More enemy advice on Horned Bob-Ohms and Toy Box and Bowser Puzzle. Heart Restorer is in there too, for a bit of health if you need it. The screenshots give a good idea of what it's all about, lava and blocky platforms, typical Mario fare really, but in 3D now of course, which was still quite something back then. All in all, helpful stuff if you were stuck in Super Mario 64 I suppose, although some of it sounds a bit try-hard for perfect scores. This page is all about getting the best scores in Super Mario 64, remember that one? Course 8, Shifting Sandland, is up first. They reckon a perfect rating of 136 is possible, which sounds a bit optimistic if you ask me, but they're laying down the gauntlet. Clapto the Vulture sounds like a right pain, and apparently, there are loads of coins both outside and inside the pyramid. They're talking about Fly Guys and Pokies, those classic enemies, and even a blue switch for some extra coins. There's even a life warp they say is a bit rubbish, takes you backwards. Not sure why anyone would want that, maybe for a cheeky one. Up early on, then it's on to Course 9, Dire Docks. Perfect rating here is a more sensible 106. They're giving tips for the bonus star, and hinting at hidden coins around the entry point. Dive underwater, and look for sloping sides and a golden coin, apparently. And those brightly coloured guppies, they say they're harmless but distracting, unless you're trying to avoid sharks when you come up for air. Sounds like typical Mario mayhem. Looks like they're trying to squeeze every last point out of these levels. Proper completionist stuff. Back then, getting those perfect ratings was all the rage, wasn't it? Good times. This page of the magazine is all about Course 10, Snowman's Land from Super Mario 64. It's got tips on getting a perfect score of 126 coins, which sounds like a right faff. They're talking about red coins, igloos, those annoying money bag things, and the sparky amp enemies. Remember those sods? Always a pain. There's also a bit about losing Lakitu in Bowser's Dark World. Apparently, there's a trick in the spiral staircase, and some glitch in Bob-Ohms Battlefield to get upside down. Sounds a bit dodgy, but those were the days, weren't they? Always finding glitches. Looking at the next month bit, it seems courses 11 to 16 are being covered, decoined, whatever that means, probably more tips and tricks. This is all from July 1997, page 65 of N64 Magazine. Simpler times, eh? Before the internet was really a thing, relying on magazines like this for all your gaming secrets. Good times, good times. This page, right, is having a look at Japanese arcades. Apparently that's where all the best coin-op games kick off, so N64 Magazine sent their man Max Everingham out to Tokyo, places like Shinjuku and Akihabara, to sample the machines. They're thinking about what games we might see on the N64 in a few months. If we're lucky, the article reckons Japanese arcades are rammed with all sorts, any age and background, especially at the weekend. They say racing and fighting games are proper popular, but the number one game is some quiz thing, which is a bit of a surprise. It even asks a bit sarcastically what this has to do with the beautiful Nintendo 64. Basically they're saying with the N64 and other powerful consoles, we should expect top arcade games at home. So, get down to the arcades and see how far things have come, apparently. Oh, and there's a little price guide for converting yen to pounds for your tokens. This page opens with a look at GTI Club by Konami, and blimey, at first glance you might think another driving game, but apparently, this one's trying to be a bit special, and in 1997 we were all gagging for something different in the arcades, weren't we? They reckon it's set in the Côte d'Azur. Very picturesque and all that. Looks like you can choose from motors like a Mini Cooper, or a Lambo, which is a bit of a range in it. Tag mode with bombs sounds a laugh with mates. Typical arcade fun. Graphics are rated an 8, sound a 7, gameplay a 9 and innovation an 8. So pretty decent scores across the board, especially for gameplay. Warrington 9. 9 Warrington 9. Flicking down, there's Operation Thunder Hurricane, also from Konami. This one is a light gun game, proper arcade blaster. I'm going to make this quick, this is a shooting game. Straight to the point, the reviewer isn't messing about. You're shooting at the screen, simple as. Settings change stage by stage, from Apocalypse Now style jungles to desert scenes, bit bonkers. They mention it costs 200 yen a pop, which they seem a bit sorry about. Graphics get a 6, sound a 7, gameplay a 2 and innovation a 1. Ouch, gameplay and innovation took a right kicking there, didn't they? Guessing it might be a bit shallow then, even for a light gun game. Finally there's Scud Racer from Sega. Scud Racer, we waited for this one. They reckon the graphics are breathtaking, typical Sega pushing the boat out. 4 cars. Porsche 911, Ferrari F40, Dodge Viper and McLaren F1. Some proper dream machines there. Day or night driving, different views, all the Sega bells and whistles you'd expect. Apparently, in the F1 car you can hit over 300 kilometers per hour. Smoking indeed. They say Scud Racer is smashing to look at, and people were queuing up to play it while GTI Club machines were gathering dust, which is a bit harsh on Konami maybe. Ratings for Scud Racer are graphics 9, sound 9, gameplay 6 and innovation 4. Graphics and sound top marks, but gameplay and innovation a bit lower. Interesting how the scores pan out across these games, isn't it? This page showcases some arcade games that were kicking about at the time. First up is Top Skater by Sega. It's one of those stand-up skateboard games, you know the ones, but this one's got grab bars, which is a bit different. Apparently you control it by stamping on the board, which sounds knackering. They reckon it's a good game though, lots of stunts, and a decent soundtrack to get you in the mood. Then there's Alpine Racer 2 from Namco. This is another skiing game, following on from the first one. Seems like they've tweaked it a bit with new courses and different ski styles, even racing against someone on another machine. The reviewer played the original in London's Trocadero, which brings back memories. They say it's pretty much the same as the first one. Controls, graphics and all. Maybe a bit tired. Apparently, there's a cheat to play as a bear, or some old blokes on skis, which is a bit daft. They weren't too impressed overall, calling it Yawn City. Lastly there's Print Club, which isn't really a game. Apparently these photo sticker machines were all the rage in Japan, especially with schoolgirls. You take your picture, and get these little sticky photos. Seems like a bit of fun, if you're into that sort of thing, and want to show off your makeup in public places. They mention selectable frames and add-ons, like Snoopy and Mickey Mouse, so you can jazz up your snaps. This page has a look at a couple of arcade games that have popped up. First off, there's Armadillo Racing. Looks a bit bonkers, doesn't it? Apparently you roll a trackball to get your armadillo around these courses in under a minute. Sounds simple enough. The reviewer says the graphics are alright, gameplay's a bit of fun but nothing amazing, and reckons it's a bit pricey for what you get. Then there's this piece about arcades, and playing Tekken 3. It talks about someone getting beaten at Tekken by some young kid in an arcade. Says it was a bit of a sound thrashing. Arcades were still a thing back then, though mostly for fighting games and that sort of thing really. Down at the bottom there's something about Print Club machines. Apparently these are everywhere in Japan, where you can take photos and get them printed out as stickers. Seems like a bit of a craze, with high schoolers queuing up for ages. There's even a funny guide called 10 Steps to Stardom on how to use the machine, bits about adjusting your hair and posing and all that. Bit much really for a sticker photo booth. This page from the mag is having a look at a couple of arcade games. Densha Day, Let's Go by Train, and Pachinko, and then there's a character select section for some beat-em-up game. Densho Day is a train driving sim. Seems a bit niche even back then, but they reckon it's popular with Japanese commuters, makes sense I suppose, escaping the crowded trains by playing a game about driving one. Funny that. They say the controls are realistic, and the graphics are supposed to be accurate to Japan Railways. Sounds like a very Japanese game to be honest, probably wouldn't have seen many of these down at the local arcade. Then there's Pachinko, which is a Japanese pinball type game, but not really like pinball at all, more like vertical pinball gambling. The article talks about smoky parlors and rows of machines, Sounds a bit grim. They say the only skill is in twiddling a knob to launch the balls, and it's more about luck and watching the machine play itself. Probably wouldn't be my cup of tea. Give me a proper game of Time Crisis or Daytona any day. Lastly, there's a character select section. Looks like it's for a multiplayer beat-em-up. They've got 4 characters profiled: Pocket Bell Girl, Surf Bloke, Betting Man, and Get a Life Geezer. Bit stereotypical if you ask me, haha. Pocket Bell Girl is into shopping, Surf Bloke hangs around video shops, Betting Man likes pachinko and racecourses, and Get a Life Geezer is lurking near Tokimeki machines, whatever they are. Each character has stats like height, weight, blood type, fighting style, stance and habitat. Bit of a weird and wonderful selection of characters, probably a laugh with a mate in 2-player, if you could find the game in the first place. The ratings at the top give graphics a 9, gameplay a 4, sound a 6, and innovation a 7, so a bit of a mixed bag overall then. This page in N64 Magazine, right, let's have a look. We're diving into the arcades this time. It's talking about My Angel Childcare Quiz from Namco. Seems like it's the top arcade machine that month, rated by sales apparently. It sounds a bit weird, like a quiz about looking after anime babies. The review is a bit sarcastic, saying it's misleading because it shows anime babies, but it's not really for young mums. They reckon it's a straightforward general knowledge quiz game. Lol. Then there's Tokimeki Memorial from Konami, which is apparently mega popular in Japan. Tokimeki means heartfelt love apparently, and the point is to get trinkets and stuff with anime girls on them. It sounds like a dating sim machine in the arcade. The reviewer is a bit bemused by it, talking about single women in Japan, and whether blokes are wasting their time on these machines. They mention you can get your results printed out, and a picture of your new woman. Blimey. There's even a story about some bloke who got a futon printed with his favorite character. Dedication, eh? After that, it's horse racing games, which they say are still in arcades. This one recreates the race in 3 ways: on the tabletop, on a computer screen, and with video. You use medals to bet, not real money, because of the ban on betting apparently. Below that there's Catchinger Z, also by Namco, which is one of those claw grabber machines, where you try to win Tokimeki dolls. And lastly, Tokimeki Disc Collection, another Konami machine, a simpler one where you try to stop the lights in the heart to win a badge. There are little profiles of characters from these machines too, like Family Man, who's apparently 1.80 meters tall, 78 kilograms, blood type O, fighting style none, and stance none, and his habitat is UFO catcher machines, home. Then there's Sprog, a kid clearly who's 1 meter tall, 35 kilograms, blood type A/B, fighting style nippy, stance low, and habitat everywhere. Bit random, these profiles. Looks like the usual slightly odd stuff you'd expect from Japanese arcades, back then and probably now. This page from N64 Magazine, bless it, is all about the Nintendo hotline. Remember that? Back in the day before the internet was really a thing, if you were stuck on a game you actually had to phone someone. Madness, eh? So they're highlighting the hotline as being there to help you out because they're nice, apparently. Not because you pay for the premium rate call, They've got a little section talking about what the Nintendo hotline is, saying they're a team of experts with vast knowledge, and they've even doubled their staff to cope with all the calls. It's open 7 days a week, which was pretty good going back then. E-Newsbowl. The main part of the page is problems, showcasing some of the top questions they've been getting. First up is Mario 64, no surprise there, everyone was playing that. It's about the blast away the wall clue for the 6th star. Apparently people were still struggling with that even then, can you believe it? The answer is to shoot the corner of the wooden platform with the cannon to reveal the star. Simple when you know how, eh? Warrington Nokri. Then there's star 6, of course, one, Bob OMB Battlefield. This one's about getting the star from behind the cage. The answer is to use the chain chomp to bash the cage open. Another classic bit of Mario 64 puzzling. Hanokuri. Next it's Shadows of the Empire, on the N64. People are running out of jetpack fuel in Gaul Spaceport. The hotline's advice is to use the stone pillars to refuel and shoot enemies before flying. Sensible stuff. Larry. Lastly for Turok, Dinosaur Hunter. Someone's found some tech armor in level 2 behind some rocks. But they need the grenade launcher, which annoyingly, isn't until level 4. So tough luck mate, come back later. Jatat. They mention everyone's been playing the Japanese version of Star Fox 64, preparing for when it comes out here. And some people are apparently walking around with scarves on their heads, and others hiding under desks. No idea what that's about, probably just magazine humor being a bit odd as usual. All in all, seems like the hotline was kept pretty busy with the big N64 games of the time. This page is from the Hotline Tips section, Proper old school games help right here, from what must be N64 Magazine, back in the day when you actually had to phone up for cheats. Can you believe it? It looks like readers were asking about Turok, Dinosaur Hunter, Wave Race 64, and Mario Kart 64. For Turok, someone was stuck in the ruins level and couldn't find the Chronoceptor piece. The helpful chap on the hotline tells them where it is. Typical of that level, wasn't it? Always missing something obvious. Another Turok question was about the gallery cheat. Apparently it only works if you enter it at the title screen, not mid-game. Useful to know. Someone was having trouble unlocking Wave Race 64 courses in 2-player mode. The answer is you need to unlock them in 1-player first, which seems fair enough. Another Wave Race question is about getting high scores on the stunt courses. Apparently pausing just as you finish a stunt keeps the announcer talking and racks up bonus points. Cheeky trick that. For Mario Kart 64, someone is asking about getting into the hole on Koopa Troopa Beach. You needed a super mushroom apparently, and good timing, always a bit hit and miss that shortcut. And someone else is asking about ghost races, which are activated by beating certain times, which makes sense. Everyone loved trying to beat the ghost times. Then there's a section on Mortal Kombat Trilogy cheats. Proper gorefest that game was. There are codes to play as Human Smoke, Motaro and Shao Kahn. All the hidden characters everyone wanted to play as. Plus codes for Secret Endurance Mode, Combat Zone Select, and Secret Options menus with more combat, Level Select, Throwing, Unlimited Runs, Bloody Combat, Smoke and Chameleon options, and even Fatality Time, Collision Boxes and on-round matches. Unlimited continues too for those of us who needed them, It mentions these codes work on the Cave, Pit 3 and Rooftop stages are quite specific. Good old MK, always full of secrets. This page from N64 Magazine, back when it was the only place to get your N64 fix, is all about cheat codes and high-score challenges. Right at the top, there's a call to arms for Mario Kart 64 players in the UK to beat their best time on Mario Raceway. Seems like they reckon PAL gamers are a bit slow or something. Cheeky. If you're good enough to beat their time and send in a photo, you could win a fancy SharkPad Pro 64 joypad. Remember those third-party controllers? Always a bit hit and miss, weren't they? Then there's a bunch of cheats for different games. International Superstar Soccer 64 has a code to unlock all-star teams if you can be bothered to mess about with button presses on the title screen. Turok, that dinosaur hunting game, has a big cheat code that unlocks everything. Proper God mode stuff. And Doom 64, yeah, that got a release on the N64, didn't it? There's a really big cheat for that too, giving you everything maxed out and skipping loads of levels. Bit extreme that, might as well watch someone else play if you do that. Yeah. FIFA 64 gets a mention for sound effects. Apparently, if you hammer the C buttons you can get crowds cheering and all sorts. Never really paid attention to that, to be honest. Star Fox 64 has a tip for a 4-player tank mode and some medal scores for different levels. And if you want to turn off the crosshair in Star Fox you can, who knew? There's also a Sector Z power-up tip, something about flying into your mothership hangar to get energy back. Must have missed that one. Lastly, they're still waiting for someone to beat Jonathan's high score on the first level of Star Fox 64. If you manage it and get a photo in, you could win a memory pack and a keyring. Good luck with that. I bet someone already has, and just hasn't bothered sending it in. Still, worth a shot if you're a Star Fox ace, This page is all about readers' top tips for N64 games, a classic feature back in the day. It's got 10 tips in total, covering a bunch of N64 launch window titles and a few others. Starting off with Doom 64, someone's found a secret exit on level 12 to skip straight to level 30. Bit of a cheat really, but who were we to complain back then, Next up is Mario Kart 64, and this one sounds a bit daft. Collecting shells on Yoshi Valley to launch yourself in the air. Sounds like a laugh, might have to try that one out. Then there's a Pilot Wing 64 tip about finding Chicken Missy at Cape Canaveral. Pilot Wings, remember that? Nice and relaxing game, if a bit slow compared to everything else at the time. Tip number 4 is for Turok. Something about facing a downward sloping ceiling and doing some move. Turok, that was a bit of a dinosaur shooter classic, wasn't it? Daniel Glenfield from Abingford sent that one in. Shadows of the Empire gets a mention, with a tip for defeating Slave One. That game was alright, kind of a stopgap Star Wars thing before Rogue Squadron really took off. Ray Gomes from Ashford reckons standing still and waiting is the key. Then there's another Turok tip, this time about a password for Quack mode, CLTHNTMNTN apparently. Cheers Sam Pugh from Crawley. Super Mario 64 gets a nod. Someone found a warp in Shifting Sandland. You could spend forever in that game and still find new things. Wave Race 64 is in there too, a trick for Glacier Park to get a massive score with a backwards flip. Wave Race, that was a looker back then. Water effects were pretty impressive for the time. Richard Elliott from Wellesbourne sent in the Mario tip, and Daryl Malpass from London did the Wave Race one. Pooh! Finally, there are 2 more Turok tips to round it off. Number 9 is about getting up to the top of the pyramid in the jungle level for an extra life, thanks to John Davies from Wallington, and the last one is a bit of a weird one involving a raptor and a Dimetrodon fighting each other. Giles Callingham from Dis sent that one in, saying it saves ammo and it's entertaining. Right you are, Giles. Underneath all the tips, there's a form to send in your own tips, with boxes for the game name, your tip, your name, address, and postcode. Looks like you could win an N64 pin badge for a decent tip, and maybe even a little bit special prize for the coveted number 1 slot. They were always trying to get readers involved, weren't they? Good times. This page from the magazine is the letters page, looks like Club 64. Right then, let's see what's on people's minds. First up, some poor bloke called Mark from Caister-on-Sea has had his parrot chew through his SNES controller cable. Blimey, talk about a pet with expensive tastes. He reckons Nintendo should make pet-proof controllers. Ed, the editor, has a bit of a laugh and suggests maybe the parrot didn't like the Mos Eisley level in a game. Cheeky! Next we have Jessica from Hong Kong. Bless her heart, she's given her boyfriend an N64 and a PlayStation, and says she loves him very much, or she's wondering about Japanese and American games working on her Hong Kong N64. Ed's saying Hong Kong machines are basically Japanese, but you need a bridge adapter for American games. Good to know if you were importing back then. Oh dear, the next letter is titled, N64 crap? 2. Sounds like someone's not happy. Paul from Manchester is laying into the N64, calling the graphics blurry, and the sound abysmal. He mentions Pilot Wings and Shadows of the Empire being duff, and swapped Shadows for Mario. He thinks Mario is alright but still not great, and FIFA is a nono. He's basically saying, if Nintendo doesn't pull their finger out and make decent games, the N64 is doomed. Graham from Liverpool chimes in too, asking when we're going to get some decent games, mentioning Mario Turok, Mario Kart, and ISS64. Ed's response is a bit sarcastic, saying maybe these readers are out of step if they think the N64 is crap, and asks for more reader opinions. Bit harsh, Ed. Then there's Gareth from Rick Mansworth, moaning about the 52% review score for NBA Hangtime. He thinks it's a great arcade basketball game, and reckons reviews should be from the perspective of basketball fans. Ed's saying their review team has experts in all sorts of games, but they couldn't find anyone who actually liked NBA Hangtime, so the score reflects that. He says they'll give good scores to basketball games they do enjoy. Fair enough, I suppose. Mackie. Lastly, someone's not happy with Zai's review of Killer Instinct Gold, calling it a 2D game from the past. Ed defends ZY, saying it's about reviewing from a certain point of view. He reckons the graphics are amazing, the gameplay's not slow like Tekken, and it's got a good training mode. He mentions Mortal Kombat and Cruisin' USA as examples of reviewing games from a specific perspective. He's saying you need to review things honestly, even if it's not everyone's cup of tea. A bit wordy from Ed, as usual, but I get his point. Looks like a lively letters page this month. This page of N64 Mag from back in '97, it's the letters page in the Dream On section where readers pitch their game ideas, bless 'em. First up, some bloke called Farouk in Swansea is moaning about the Killer Instinct Gold review score, 62%, thinks it should be higher even though he admits it's just perfectly enjoyable and no more. Ed, ever so slightly sarcastic, just says they preferred playing War Gods because of the daft announcer voice. Sums up Killer Instinct Gold pretty well, to be honest. Solid game, but not mind-blowing even then. Dahi. Then there's a sensible letter from a Chris in Wrexham, talking about game reviews needing to be thorough, especially for those of us who were, shall we say, between jobs back then. He's worried about magazines just rushing out reviews based on previews. Fair point, Chris. Ed actually agrees, saying they'd rather do a proper review than get a world exclusive. Good on 'em. Moving on, we have the usual mix of reader letters. One geezer, Ian from Belfast, is chuffed they predicted the N64 price drop, and is finally getting one. Then there's young Oliver, wanting his mum to know the N64 is cool. Bless. Ed confirms it is, naturally. Ketty. Right. Then Matt from Macclesfield gets a bit leery, threatening to blow up PlayStations with a sawn-off shotgun and then come for the N64 if his letter isn't printed. Bit much, Matt. Ed's reply is quite dry, saying someone called James is already on PlayStation demolition duties. Funny that. Thomas, a Peter from Rustington, is thanking them for some old Superplay freebies after that mag closed. Superplay, now that was a decent mag back in the SNES days. Ed tells Peter he's got too much time on his hands and needs to stop playing shogi. Shogi? Who even played shogi? Whoa! And then some random bloke Sam, from Lewis, just sends in gobbledygook, and KUPO, Ed. Ed just replies KUPO, Ed. Right then, Down at the bottom, in Dream On, readers' game ideas. Simon from Leeds wants a cannonball run game like Cruisin' USA but better, with all the movie cars. Could be a laugh actually, especially with roadblocks and police chases. Max from Twickenham wants a Doom-style X-Files game, running around dark forests shooting monsters like Tombs and the Flukeman. Sounds a bit generic, but X-Files was massive then. Someone else wants a 3x3 Eyes RPG, based on the anime, with beat-em-up combat. Never got into that anime myself. In the middle, there's a mention of an X-Files PC game, but apparently, it was mostly video footage. Not much gameplay then. Take a. Ben from RAF Bruggen, he's got a weird one, a Benny Cax J2 game, like Wonder Project J2, where you have to sort out Dr. Cax's son and get a date with Laura the receptionist. Squiggle vision graphics. Eh? Ed's proper confused by that one. Can't blame him. Waya. Finally, Hobming Singh from Holland wants a Dragon Ball Z RPG beat 'em up, like Secret of Mana meets Street Fighter. Sounds ambitious. Ed points out it might be a bit too much for the cartridge and end up like Final Fight. He's probably right. Cart space was always a pain back then. Tuki. And that's your lot, game ideas and reader rants. Standard letters page fair for an N64 mag in '97. This page from N64 Mag, it's their I'm the best section, classic bit in these mags back in the day. It's all about sending in your top scores to prove you're a gaming god, and if you're good enough they'd print your name. Maybe even get a badge. Proper bragging rights for the school playground that was. Looks like this month's games they're tracking are Mario Kart 64, Wave Race 64, Super Mario 64 and Turok. For Mario Kart they've got Luigi Circuit, Mario Circuit and Mario Raceway, but no times submitted for Luigi Circuit yet, poor showing. For Wave Race it's Sunny Beach, and then Super Mario 64 has the foot race with Koopa the Quick and Peach slide challenges. Turok is time challenge mode. It's showing both American/Japanese and UK times for some games, which was a big deal then with import games being all the rage. They've got a star performance shout out to Anil Daunt from Guernsey who broke the minute barrier on Mario Circuit in Mario Kart, proper impressive for the time. Apparently he's the first N64 owner to do it in the NTSC version. He's getting a memory pack for it, not bad. Then there are a couple of letters, one from a Gareth Jacks moaning about Blastcore, reckons it's brilliant and can't believe they haven't got gold medals on everything. Bit keen, Gareth. He's also wondering when they'll review Star Fox 64. Another letter from a Clifford Bonnie who's not happy with their Wave Race review, says they forgot to mention borders and slow speed. And printed Japanese times not pale. Bit of a slap on the wrist for them there, fair play. Ed, the editor, apologizes and says they'll be more careful about pale and import times in future, learning curve and all that back then. Looking ahead to next month, they'll be covering Star Fox and Blastcore times. Ah, good times. Simpler times. Sending in photos of your telescreen, hoping they printed your name. This page in N64 Magazine is the letters section, called Letters, funnily enough. Right at the top, there's a bloke called Darren Jaggers, moaning about Mario 64 being boring, tedious and slow. Can you believe it? He gave it 4 out of 10. Blimey, some people just don't get it, do they? Must be a PlayStation fanboy. Rory. Then there's a section about inventions for the N64. Russell Coughlin wants to chuck control pads into a pond for prizes. A bit daft if you ask me, but I suppose they are trying to be funny. Leighton Page is having a dig at the magazine, suggesting they're making up good letters to keep the prizes. Cheeky, Ed, who seems to be the editor replying to the letters, assures everyone the letters are real, and even shows a photo of a pile of letters as proof classic. The main part of the page is called So Tell Me This, where readers ask questions about the N64. Stephen Mighton is complaining about the Virtual Boy, saying Mario Tennis was rubbish. Well, some of us liked Red Alert on the Virtual Boy, it wasn't all bad. Ed's reply is quite fair, saying it just didn't have enough good games and was a bit weird. Ryan McBride wants to know about Donkey Kong Country 64, and whether you'll be able to add new content to games with the 64DD. Everyone was buzzing about Donkey Kong 64 back then, wasn't there? And the 64DD was a mystery box we were all hoping it would do amazing things. Ed's reply is quite informative, saying Donkey Kong Country 64 is likely but no date yet, and mentioning that Rare is involved. Kwabena Achiampong wants to know about the best memory cards, and if official ones are better than third-party ones. Ed reckons official ones are best for reliability, and trusts them more with important save data. Paul Daniel is asking about the rumble puck and what buru means. Apparently it's Japanese for a vibrating noise, who knew? Elliot Johnson is going on about cooperative play, mentioning games like Alien Breed and Streets of Rage. He's wondering if there are any good co-op games on the N64. Ed points out ISS 64 has 4-player, and mentions other sports games for co-op fun like FIFA and Wayne Gretzky's hockey. Chonsarshia. Andrew Crane wants to know what happened to Gunpei Yokoi, the inventor of the Game Boy and Virtual Boy, and if he's still at Nintendo. Ed mentions he left and started his own company. Didn't know that at the time. There are screenshots of Bomberman and N64 on the page. All in all, typical letters page stuff, a mix of praise, complaints and questions, and Ed trying to be a helpful and slightly sarcastic magazine editor. Takes you back, doesn't it? This page is having a look at the American side of the games industry for the N64. Seems like last month they were in Japan, which makes sense as Nintendo is Japanese after all. They're calling this piece Have a Nice Play, which is a bit of a cheesy title if you ask me, but alright. Seems like last May were. So it starts off by saying America might have invented video games, but since the NES, Nintendo's machines have really dominated. Apparently there's a whole army of US developers ready to make games for the N64. It mentions that Japanese games are more surreal and dreamlike, whereas American coders have refined action and violence and all that, just like in their films and telly. They're saying it's all about big budget spectacle, which inevitably means more licensed games, games that are more about presentation than content. Bit cynical, eh? Then it talks about Electronic Arts, who have finally committed to the N64, which is good news, I suppose. They made loads of sports games for the SNES, so no surprise there. They're also mentioning Williams coin-op conversions, like NBA Jam and Mortal Kombat. Mortal Kombat, blimey, that was all the rage back then with all the blood and guts, causing a right fuss with the parents, wasn't it? And then there's movie spin-offs from LucasArts, and new developers like Paradigm. The writer reckons Japan has been responsible for most N64 games so far, but American developers are getting to grips with the system now, so maybe things will even out. They finish by saying it's time to get ready for the Hollywood factor. Sounds like they are anticipating a lot of movie-time games coming our way, some good, some probably not so much, but we'll see. Let's hope they are not all just big on graphics and low on actual gameplay. This page delves into the story of Nintendo's journey in the United States, back from the early days. It starts by reminding us how back in the early 80s, when Atari fell apart, America wasn't really bothered about video games anymore. Then Nintendo, bless them, came along with the NES and slowly but surely got things moving again. They mention how Nintendo of America, run by Minoru Arakawa, had to work hard to get into the market, and eventually they did in 1985. The article talks about how persistent Nintendo were and how they figured out what the Americans wanted, which was apparently different to us lot. They signed up some of the big Japanese names early on, Konami, Data East, Capcom, all those. And then some American developers, like Acclaim and Electronic Arts, jumped on board too. It mentions the SNES era, and how Nintendo kept tight control, maybe a bit too tight, over who made games for their system, with those famous lockout chips. They talk about the accusations of unfair trading, and some bloke from Nintendo of America, Peter Main, saying if they were an American company nobody would say a word. Bit cheeky that. Looking ahead to the N64, the article suggests the battle for dominance will be tough, just like it was with the SNES, but they reckon Nintendo will probably come out on top again. They mention the types of games we can expect, shoot-em-ups, action games and that, all sounding a bit flashier than what we were used to on the SNES. They also reckon with games like Zelda and Square's RPGs doing well, Americans are getting into story-driven games, which is good to hear. And there's talk of beat-em-ups making a comeback in a more Western style, mentioning Midway's Weapon Lord and Heavy Mace as examples. Sounds a bit like Mortal Kombat, doesn't it? Anyway, it all sounds promising for N64 owners in the UK apparently, so we'll have to wait and see. This page in N64 Magazine is all about Paradigm, one of those American developers making waves on the N64. Apparently they started out doing military simulations, which is a bit different from what we're used to seeing on Nintendo consoles. In it, the article talks about how Pilotwings 64 is their big success, and it's what's put them on the map as a top third-party developer. There's a screenshot from Pilotwings 64, showing the little gyrocopter thing, you know the one. It was a pretty unique game at the time, wasn't it? Bit of a departure from the usual blasting things, more about gentle gliding and landing. Gary Bandy from Paradigm is quoted saying they didn't expect to be doing Pilotwings, but they're glad they did. Fair enough, it was a decent launch title. Hattie. They're also previewing their next game, Aero Fighters Assault, which was also known as Sonic Wings Assault apparently. This one looks more like your typical arcade-style fighter jet game from the screenshots. They're saying it's going to be more of a traditional combat simulator compared to Pilotwings. You'll be flying planes like F-14s, Eurofighters and all sorts, taking on enemy planes like MiGs and Sukhois. Sounds like they're going for a bit more action this time around. Ooh, Apparently the game will have levels set in places like Tokyo, New York, and even Antarctica, battling flying fortresses and stealth battleships. Sounds a bit bonkers, to be honest, but in a good way, I suppose. The article mentions Paradigm has also developed some kind of development system called Fusion Power to help other companies make games for the N64, and they reckon Virgin and Namco might be using it. So they're not just making games but helping others too, which is alright, I guess. Overall, it paints Paradigm as a pretty important developer for the N64 back then, moving on from simulators to proper console games. This page is having a look at Midway and Acclaim, two big names back in the day. Midway, blimey, they've been around the block, haven't they? Started with pinball, then got into the coin-op scene, and now they are all over the N64. They've already given us Doom 64, Wayne Gretzky's 3D hockey, and Cruisin' USA. Apparently Mortal Kombat 4 is on the way, which is going 3D for the first time, and they're doing Robotron X and even Joust, can you believe it? Joust in the 90s. They're also trying to make Mortal Kombat Mythologies. Sub-Zero, which is like a platform adventure thing. Sounds a bit dodgy, to be honest, after the last Mortal Kombat game, which was a bit pants. They're also bringing over San Francisco Rush, which should be better than Cruisin' USA, and there are beat-em-ups like War Gods, Biofreaks, and Atari's Mace. So lots of digitized fighters then. They reckon Mace will be different because of the weapons, swords, and axes and all that. They're banging on about Quake 64 as well, saying it's gonna be well good like Doom but better, bigger monsters, built from polygons apparently, which sounds alright. They're saying the levels are the same as the PC version but with fog and better graphics, which is fair enough. Bit of a shame there's no multiplayer in Quake 64 on the N64, because of the visuals being too much apparently, just single player only. Still, Andrew Houlihan from Midway reckons it'll be brilliant, even without the multiplayer. We'll see, won't we? Towler? Then there's Acclaim, founded way back in '87, seems they are a big deal for Nintendo games. They did Turok, Dinosaur Hunter, and Turok 2 is coming, which is good news for Turok fans, whoever they are. Apparently they're thinking about cheap level packs for Turok 2. They're also doing NFL Quarterback Club 98, an American football game. Apparently it looks really good, proper detailed player models, and they've used motion capture from some New York Jets player, Adrian Murrell. Sounds like they're trying to push the boat out a bit, with that one graphics-wise. There are screenshots dotted around. Wayne Gretzky's 3D hockey looks like ice hockey, funnily enough. Mace. The Dark Age looks like a digitized fighter with blokes with big weapons. Hexen 2 PC looks a bit dark and gloomy. MK Trilogy, well, it's Mortal Kombat, innit? And Quake PC looks like your standard brown corridor shooter. So yeah, that's the games from Midway and Acclaim then. This page delves into what's going on with the American developers for the N64. First up, it's Interplay, who have been around for ages, even back to the early days of gaming in '83, can you believe it? They're known for games like Rock'n'Roll Racing and Earthworm Jim on the SNES, or SNES as some folk pronounce it. They are bringing Clayfighter to the N64, called Clayfighter 63 1/3. Sounds a bit daft, doesn't it? Apparently, it will have full 3D locations and even more bonkers claymation fighters, like a disembodied hand. The Statue of Liberty, eh? They're also doing Earthworm Jim 3 in 3D, which is due next April. Ultra Descent seems to have been canned, mind you. Hey, then there's Epic Mega Games, probably not a name many of us know over here, but they're big in the PC shareware scene and causing a stir with their Unreal project. Sounds very hush-hush about the N64 version. Apparently it might be for the 64DD add-on thingy. No idea who's actually developing it for them though. Virgin's next, and since they got bought out by Viacom they haven't been quite as loud, or as productive it seems. They're still pushing on with Game Freak Boy for the N64. There's talk of a Command & Conquer game, but it sounds a bit like wishful thinking. And Red Alert, which is basically Command & Conquer 2, might not even appear on the N64 until well into next year, if at all. Shiny Entertainment, who are part of Interplay, are still committed to the N64 and say the original creators are sticking with it. They reckon their games might be around 99 quid, which is a bit steep, innit? They're on about physics and new game ideas. Sounds a bit ambitious, doesn't it? You say. Ion Storm is a new company set up by some big names, including John Romero, the Doom and Quake bloke. They've already done some big deals and are making games using the Quake engine. They've got Daikatana and Tom Hall's Anachronox in the works. We might even see Daikatana 64 by mid-98. Apparently Quake for the N64 is coming along nicely too. They are saying their games are massive in terms of content, so porting to the N64 might be tricky because of the storage space. They might get someone else to do the ports rather than doing it themselves. Lastly, there's Singletrack, who used to just do PlayStation games, but now they are on board with Nintendo. Don't expect Twisted Metal on the N64, but they will probably make similar explosive multiplayer games. Sounds alright, I suppose. The next page in N64 Magazine is having a gander at what some of the game developers are up to for the old Ultra 64. First up, it's Konami, Japanese mob, obviously, but they've been in the US for yonks, since the old SNES days. Apparently they are still fiddling about with PlayStation games, but they're doing at least one title for the N64. Sounds like it might be sports related, knowing Konami, wagay. Then there's Sierra. Remember Red Baron on PC? Well, they were going to do a version for the N64, but that's been binned. They're sticking to PCs and Macs now. Might be looking at getting a smaller N64 developer on board though, so we'll see what happens there. Gamatech is next. They made some proper old-school NES games, like Kawasaki Caribbean Challenge and Vanna White's Wheel of Fortune. Spectre on the SNES too, apparently. They're working on a 3D shoot-'em-up, with proper polygonal robots for the N64. Sounds a bit like a cartoon robot thing. They're banging on about some fancy tech called multi-branching chronosync algorithm, MBCSA for short, which is probably marketing guff, but they reckon it makes the game respond in real time. Apparently you can change your robot from a fighter to a guardian type, each with different strengths and weaknesses. Interesting if they can pull it off. Ocean are in the spotlight next. European company, but their US lot are doing Mission Impossible for the N64. They want it out for the summer, to tie in with that second Mission movie. And it's supposed to be a worldwide release, not just Japan first then ages later for us. They're basing it on impossible missions, funnily enough. Talking about clever AI, so characters react differently to what you do. Apparently they are still waiting for the movie script to figure out the game's plot. Sounds like they're cutting it a bit fine if it's out in the summer. Whoa! Lastly, it's Kemco and Boss Game Studios. Kemco are Japanese owned, been around for ages, doing games on the NES and SNES, even Disney stuff. They're doing Top Gear games for both SNES and N64. For the N64 version, Top Gear Rally, they're working with Boss Game Studios. These are the spider lot, seems like that's all they've done. Top Gear Rally's got split screen, weather effects, and good looking scenery, and nighttime lighting. Sounds like it could be one of the better driving games, coming to the N64. The next page in this issue delves into American N64 developers, and what they're bringing to the console. It starts with Electronic Arts, or EA as we all knew them. Apparently they started way back in '82, trying to be like Hollywood studios. They were a big deal in sports games, and it mentions FIFA 64 being out already, plus the usual Madden football, NBA Live, NHL hockey, and PGA golf coming to the N64. They were also doing DreamWorks titles, hinting at the Lost World game, which was alright I suppose. Percus. Next up is LucasArts. With Shadows of the Empire already on the N64, people were wondering what else they'd do. Apparently not much more Nintendo stuff from George Lucas was on the cards at the time, which is a bit of a shame really. They mention maybe dusting off Indiana Jones for the N64, which would have been interesting. The article quotes Eric Johnston, the lead programmer of Shadows of the Empire, talking about how they were developing the game for a completely new kind of machine, as the N64 was so different from anything else. Mark Hy Hutchinson from LucasArts is also quoted, mentioning the SGI computer they used, saying it was the biggest and loudest. They struggled to get the multi-style gameplay working, especially the hovertrain level, which they called a bear to make. Then there's Angel Studios. These guys, Paradigm, hadn't done Nintendo games before, but they were known for their graphics skills, having done virtual reality stuff for that naff Lawnmower Man movie and music videos. They were working on Buggy Boogie, which apparently Miyamoto himself had a hand in changing from a family game into an action racer. It's supposed to have a two-player mode and a time attack thing with power-ups. Sounds a bit like a kart racer but with buggies I guess. Paula. Lastly there's Player One, a new developer doing a conversion of Robotron X for GT. It's based on the Williams coin-op, and they're porting it to the N64. They say it'll be the same as the PlayStation version, with loads of levels but with better camera tracking and visuals thanks to the N64. They reckon the N64 graphics will make it look better than their previous efforts, which is what you'd hope really. Below this section are screenshots, one for Diablo and one for Blizzard. It mentions that Blizzard, known for PC games, hadn't jumped into Nintendo consoles yet but might be interested in the N64 for their Diablo-style action RPG, suggesting a potential N64 version with multiplayer and better graphics for the isometric 3D dungeons and pre-rendered monsters. That would have been something if it had happened. This page of N64 Magazine has a look at a few games coming to the console back in the day. First up is H20 and their game, Tetrisphere. Apparently Nintendo pinched it from under Atari's nose, which is a bit cheeky, innit? It's being called an anti-Tetris game, which sounds intriguing, and they reckon it'll have cleaner visuals and a 2-player mode for the N64, plus all the usual chain reaction and explosion bits and bobs. They were saying to expect it sometime that summer. Then there's Duke Nukem 64, which is being stripped down apparently. PC developer 3D Realms are still deciding if they're going to fully commit, but Software Creations over here are doing the conversion. There's a bit of a worry about the content from the PC version, you know, with all the dodgy bits like pawn shops and strip shows. Nintendo might have kittens about that, wouldn't they? Apparently the original Duke Nukem was great fun in multiplayer, and they're making the most of the N64's fogging effects and adding a split-screen mode for up to 4 players, a bit like Mario Kart. Interestingly, they've changed the view from first-person to behind Duke, which they think will make the jumping bits easier. Let's see if that's actually a good thing though. 3. Moving on, 3DO and their game Battlesport 64. Bit of an odd one for Nintendo, given the console rivalry, but they've given it the thumbs up. It's an update of their old Battlesport game, a future sport thing like Ball Blazer, with Toon 2 hovercraft blasting each other. Cyclone Studios are doing the work, and they're promising more detail and complex arenas. They're even thinking about letting you damage the scenery, which sounds alright. Apparently 4-player link-up could be on the cards too. It's due sometime next year, so a bit of a wait for that one. Lastly, there's Vic Tokai and Dark Rift. It's actually the American side of Vic Tokai doing this one, not the Japanese lot. It's a 3D beat-em-up. They're hoping it'll be better than War Gods, which, let's be honest, wouldn't be too hard, would it? Still, could be a decent punch-up. So there you have it, a mixed bag of games heading our way. Some look alright, some sound a bit dodgy, but hey, that's the N64 for you. This page of N64 Magazine, eh? Well, it's certainly got that typical 90s vibe going on. Big, bold text shouting about thermals keeping you up all night, bit dramatic, isn't it? Looks like they are talking about Pilotwings 64, judging by those hang gliders floating about in the sky. One even looks like it's rocking the stars and stripes. Gweh. Flipping over to the side panel, we see it's issue 4, dated July 4th. Reviews this month include Mario Kart 64, obviously a big deal, and their Mortal Kombat trilogy, which was probably still causing a bit of a stir with all that digitized blood, even if it was getting a bit long in the tooth by then. And then there's War Gods, which I vaguely remember. Looks like it got a respectable 72%, whatever TAC means. Under Other Great Stuff, there's a mixed bag. Struggle Hard, Holy Magic Century, Sonic Wings Assault. Vaguely remember seeing those around. Then there's the usual how-to guides, always good for a bit of a chuckle. Mastering International Superstar Soccer 64, playing Mahjong, being a Super Mario 64 expert, surviving a Japanese arcade, typical magazine fodder really, and a tour of America's N64 developers. Sounds like a slightly less exciting holiday than it's made out to be, but hey, maybe they got to eat some decent burgers. Simpler times.